The ship that became a stranger. What if everything in you changed, but you still called yourself you? What if your memories were altered, your values replaced, and even your body reconstructed, cell by cell? At what point does the person standing there become someone else? This is the heart of the ancient thought experiment known as the ship of Theseus. Imagine a ship, docked in a harbor, slowly undergoing repairs. Over time, every single plank of wood, every nail, every rope is replaced. Nothing original remains. And yet, people still point to it and say, "That's the ship of Theseus." Now imagine that someone took all the old parts and rebuilt the original ship elsewhere. Which one is the real ship? Apply this to a person. You. Your cells regenerate. Your memories fade or are edited by your brain. Your beliefs shift over years. You age, change, forget, grow. Are you still the same you? If we rebuilt someone with the same memories and personality, but a different body, would that still be them? If your brain was copied into a digital machine, is that now you? If your biological body is slowly replaced with artificial parts, when do you disappear? Derek Parfit pushed this puzzle further. He argued there is no deep self that persists over time. No soul, no immutable core, just a bundle of experiences, like a story being told by a constantly updating narrator. Your identity, then, is not like a stone that remains. It's like a flame, always burning, always moving, never the same from one moment to the next. That's disturbing, because it means there is no permanent you. There's no solid self behind the mask. The person you were at age 7 is gone. The one at 18, a ghost. Even the one reading this now will vanish into memory. And if that's true, what exactly are we trying to preserve, protect, or find when we search for our true self? We grieve the death of loved ones. But were they already dying every year as their self changed? We speak of becoming who we are, as if there's a final version of us waiting somewhere. But maybe there isn't. Maybe we're chasing a shadow that never stands still. This puzzle forces you to question what makes you real. If identity is just psychological continuity, linked memories and mental states, then your sense of self is fragile. A stroke, a drug, a brain injury, even time itself can break the chain. And once broken, who are you? Parfit's conclusion is devastating. Identity is not what matters. That's not comforting. That's terrifying, because it means that personal survival, this thing we cling to, might be a fiction. It's not death we should fear, but the realization that the person we think we are never truly existed. And if the self is an illusion, just a name we give to a momentary pattern, then what is it that loves, regrets, dreams, or remembers? The ship sails on, but maybe no one is steering. The free will delusion. You made a choice today, or at least, that's what it felt like. Maybe you chose to scroll, to click, to read this. But what if none of those were actual choices? What if every single action you've ever taken was already determined before you were born? This is the core of the free will problem. And it's not some abstract riddle. It strikes at the very root of how we live. Most people believe they have free will, that they make decisions, that their life could go one way or another depending on their effort, character, or luck. But physics and neuroscience don't seem to agree. Start with the physical universe. At every level, things obey cause and effect. Every particle, every brain cell, every chemical signal reacts because of something before it. Your brain is made of atoms. Your thoughts emerge from neurons firing. And those neurons, they fire because of inputs, genes, environment, hormones, childhood, trauma, caffeine. Where is the you in all that? If every choice you make is the result of prior causes you didn't choose, your DNA, your upbringing, your brain wiring, then how is it really a choice? If you rewound time and played it again, you'd do the same thing, because you couldn't do otherwise. Neuroscience goes further. Studies show your brain decides to do something milliseconds before you become conscious of that decision. You feel like you chose to pick up the glass, but your brain already started the action before you knew it. So what? Then, is the conscious you even doing? Some philosophers try to redefine free will as the ability to act according to your desires. But where did those desires come from? You didn't choose them either. You didn't pick your fears, your preferences, your cravings. You just became aware of them. And here's the uncomfortable part. If there is no free will, then every hero and every villain may just be a product of circumstances. People don't deserve praise or blame. Not really. A serial killer and a saint may both be running pre-programmed scripts. The criminal didn't choose his impulses. The charitable woman didn't invent her compassion. They are products of events, genes, and randomness. That doesn't make morality meaningless, but it makes it harder to justify. Punishment becomes control, not justice. Praise becomes reinforcement, not virtue. And if you accept this, it changes how you see everything: relationships, guilt, ambition, even love. What if that person didn't betray you by choice, but because they couldn't do otherwise? What if you didn't fail because of laziness, but because that was already built into your path? The idea that you could have done differently starts to dissolve, and in its place comes something darker. You were always going to do this, no matter how much it hurts, no matter how much you wish you could go back and change it. You won't, because you couldn't. The simulation trap. You look at your screen. You see words. You think they're real. But how do you know? This is not paranoia. It's one of the most unnerving possibilities ever proposed. We might be living in a simulation. Not metaphorically. Literally. Everything you see, feel, and think might be part of an artificial world, running on someone else's computer. It starts with probability. Philosopher Nick Bostrom laid it out like this. If a civilization becomes technologically advanced enough, it will be able to create simulated realities, virtual worlds so convincing that the people inside won't know they're not real. Now imagine that happens, not once, but millions of times. If even one advanced civilization runs ancestor simulations, they could simulate trillions of conscious beings. So the odds that we are the single original biological species, not one of the simulations, are vanishingly small. Statistically, it's more likely we're in a simulation than not. That's disturbing enough. But it gets worse. If this is a simulation, it means nothing is physical, just code. Death may be deletion, not an afterlife. God might exist as a programmer. Your emotions could be engineered. Your relationships scripted. Your memories implanted. You can't escape it by saying, well, everything feels real. That's the trap. The whole point of a good simulation is that you don't know. In fact, any attempt to test the theory might itself be part of the simulation, just another input to monitor how you react. Some try to shrug it off. Even if we're simulated, so what? Life still feels real. But that's not the problem. The problem is control. If you're in a simulation, someone or something could be watching, adjusting, deleting, or reprogramming you at will. You don't control your environment. You don't control your fate. You don't even control whether you're allowed to know the truth. And what happens if the simulation gets shut down? Does everything vanish? Did anyone ever really exist? The simulation hypothesis doesn't just question your senses. It tears the meaning out of them. Every dream, every goal, every piece of knowledge could be artificial. Reality itself becomes untrustworthy. And here's the twist. The more technology we build, VR, AI, quantum computing, the more likely we are to create our own simulations, making the cycle repeat. If we do it, then others probably already have. And that means we're not first. We're probably not even real. The moral luck trap. You think you're a good person. You've never killed anyone. You try to be kind. You don't steal, lie, or cheat, at least not in ways that matter. So you must be decent, right? But what if your morality is just a byproduct of chance? What if you're only a good person because nothing tested you hard enough to be bad? This is the problem of moral luck. It says your character isn't really yours. It's shaped by circumstances you didn't choose. And that means your sense of being good might be built on nothing more than convenience. Take two people, both equally reckless. Both drive drunk. One hits a pedestrian and ruins a life. The other gets home safely. One goes to prison. The other sleeps in their own bed. But the only difference between them was luck, timing, location, coincidence. We treat them differently. But should we? Philosopher Thomas Nagel said we often judge people based on outcomes beyond their control. That's moral luck. A soldier gets branded a hero or a war criminal depending on how the battle unfolds. A parent's good parenting may depend on how their child turns out. A political leader is remembered as a visionary or a disaster, often based on chance, not ethics. The scary part? This applies to you. You might not have stolen because you were never desperate. You might not have lied because you were never cornered. You might not have betrayed because you were never tempted by something worth betraying for. But what if you were? What if life pushed you just a little harder? Would your goodness survive it? Moral luck suggests that you don't know. And worse, you can't know. Because until you're tested, your virtue is theoretical. It's easy to be kind when you're comfortable. Easy to be honest when the truth costs nothing. So how much credit do you deserve for being good? Or put differently, how would your life look if the variables had changed? Maybe you were born with a stable family, with health, with support, with time. Maybe you didn't end up addicted, angry, or lost because life didn't set that trap for you. And maybe that's not something to feel guilty about, but it is something to reconsider the next time you feel morally superior. Because if your goodness is conditional, dependent on things beyond your control, then how solid is it really? That's the trap. You build your self-image around being a good person, but moral luck whispers, maybe you were just lucky enough not to be tested in the right way to fail. And that's not morality. That's roulette, the infinite library. Imagine a library that contains every possible book that could ever exist. Every combination of every letter, every sentence, every paragraph. It holds books that make sense, books that are nonsense, books that describe your life, books that get one detail wrong, books that describe your death accurately. This is Borges' Library of Babel, and it's not just a story. It's a real thought experiment about meaning, truth, and madness. In a library of infinite books, everything exists somewhere. Every fact, every lie, every possibility. You could find a book that explains the cure for every disease, and also one that gives you false steps that would kill you if followed. Both exist. But how would you know which is which? Now apply that to life. In a world of infinite possibilities, infinite interpretations, infinite narratives, which one is true? You say you believe in something. That certain facts matter. That a particular worldview makes sense. But in a library of Babel reality, your belief is just one volume on one shelf in one wing of infinity. There are a trillion others that disagree, and each feels just as convincing to someone else. So what anchors your truth? The library metaphor exposes the collapse of meaning in a world that allows too much information, and we're living in it. Social media, news, AI-generated content, conspiracies, narratives, beliefs, every position, every argument, every truth has its counter-volume. And most people just read the first book that confirms their bias and stop. But in a truly infinite library, that's suicide, because for every truth, there's a million lies dressed exactly the same. So you start to panic. You try to find structure. But the deeper you search, the more the shelves mock you. Because in the Library of Babel, meaning isn't found, it's generated. And if it's generated, it can be manipulated, which means it's not fixed, which means you might never know what's actually real. This isn't just about books. It's about your life. Every moment you try to make sense of something, morality, purpose, identity, you're picking one story from the library and hoping it's not a trick. But how would you ever know? And even worse, What if the book that contains the meaning of your life does exist, but you'll never find it? You could spend a lifetime searching. Or you could believe the first story that feels good enough. Most people do. But the library doesn't care. It holds the truth. And 1,000 fakes. And maybe the most terrifying part is this. Even if you found the right book, you wouldn't believe it. Not anymore. Not in a world where truth has too many copies. The problem of future you. You assume you're still going to be you tomorrow. The same person. With the same values. The same memories. The same goals. Maybe a little older. Maybe more tired. But still you. But what if the person you become isn't you anymore? This is the disturbing implication behind temporal identity breakdown. The idea that your future self might be so different that they could be a stranger occupying your body. And yet, you'll be held accountable for their actions. Let's start simple. You make a decision today. You save money. You avoid a temptation. You exercise. You endure something painful. Why? Because you want future you to benefit. You want her to have a better life. But what if she doesn't care? What if future you wastes the money, breaks the promise, gains back the weight, throws away the progress? She'll still have your face, your name, your fingerprints, but she won't feel your effort, your discipline, your struggle. To her, your sacrifice might be invisible, or worse, inconvenient, and you'll never be there to stop her. This is more than a motivational problem. It's a philosophical fracture in how we think about the self. We assume continuity, but that's not guaranteed. People change, radically. They switch beliefs, identities, ethics. They do things their past selves would be horrified by. And yet, legally, morally, socially, we treat them as the same person. Why? If a stranger suddenly inhabited your body and made decisions that harmed your life, we'd call it possession. But when it's just future you making choices that violate past you's values, we call it growth, or aging, or life. But maybe it's something darker. Maybe there's no permanent you across time, just a series of temporary agents, loosely connected by memory and habit, each hijacking your future for their own purposes. You've probably already betrayed yourself before, broken your own promises, given up on your own plans, looked back with shame or confusion, wondering, why did I do that? That wasn't me. Maybe you're right. Maybe it wasn't. This puzzle breaks the idea that your future is something you own. You don't. You just hope the next version of you doesn't ruin everything. And there's no guarantee she won't. That's the horror. You are accountable for someone who does not exist yet. And she is accountable for someone she no longer remembers being. You are making sacrifices for a stranger. And one day, someone will suffer for what you're doing now. But it won't be you. It'll be someone who looks like you, signs your name, pays your debts, faces your consequences, but never consented to your decisions. So when you say, I'll deal with that later, be careful. You're not deferring the pain. You're outsourcing it to a version of yourself who might hate you for it. The whole in time. You know how old you are. You have a birth date, a memory of yesterday, a plan for tomorrow. You experience time as a line, a forward motion, 1 second at a time. But what if that's not what time actually is? What if the flow of time, your most basic experience, is just a biological illusion? Philosophers and physicists have long struggled with this. Your experience of now feels real, but it's not a physical thing. It can't be measured. You can point to length, to mass, even to space, but there is no ruler for now. This is called the problem of the present. In physics, all moments in time are treated as equally real. The laws of relativity don't say now is special. In fact, your now is different from someone else's now, depending on their speed and position. There is no universal present. So what are you experiencing? Some theories say time doesn't flow at all. Every moment, past, present, and future, exists simultaneously. You are not moving through time. You are simply experiencing a slice of it, like frames on a film reel. You're not traveling. You're playing back a recording. This is called the block universe theory, and it means your future is already written. Your past is permanently fixed. You are a static structure in 4 dimensions: height, width, depth, and duration. Your consciousness just feels like it's moving, but it isn't. Now ask yourself, if time doesn't flow, what is change? What is growth? What is death? If everything is frozen in space-time, are you already dead? Already born? Already forgotten? You might think, but I remember the past. I don't remember the future. That must mean something. But memory is just brain function, just chemical traces. If your brain was wired differently, you'd remember the future and forget the past, and it would feel just as natural, just as convincing. The arrow of time might not be real. It might just be how your brain processes entropy. And if that's true, then your sense of becoming, of evolving, is a fiction. You are not a creature in motion. You are a statue in space-time. The past isn't gone. The future isn't waiting. They're already there. You just don't have access. That's the hole in time, the space where the illusion lives. And once you realize it's not a river but a frozen landscape, your entire life becomes something else. Not a journey, a coordinate. You're still guilty. You didn't mean to hurt anyone, but you did. You said the wrong thing. You didn't show up. You let someone down, and now they're angry, or gone, or changed forever. And you tell yourself, I didn't intend that. But intention doesn't erase consequence. This is the brutal core of the responsibility illusion. The idea that you are accountable for outcomes regardless of what you meant. The world runs on effects, not motives. You might think you're a good person because you meant well. But if your actions caused harm, that label doesn't matter. We're taught to believe in fairness. That blame belongs to bad people with bad motives. But that's not how life works. You can destroy someone's trust accidentally. You can cause trauma by being careless. You can shape someone's entire future through a moment of distraction. And here's the worst part. You might never even know. You may have been someone's last attempt at connection. Their final test of whether people are worth trusting. Their last fragile hope that someone would stay. You may have failed without realizing you were being measured. And even if you did know, you can't undo it. The damage is already written into their nervous system, into how they love, into what they'll never try again, into the walls they'll build next time. You think your apology fixes that? Intentions are invisible. Outcomes are permanent. Even legal systems, which are obsessed with intent, still punish people who kill accidentally. That's not because they're evil, it's because harm was done, and someone must answer for it. Now flip it around. Someone hurts you, but they say they didn't mean it. Do you feel healed? Does your pain vanish because they were confused or overwhelmed? Or does that just make it worse, that they didn't care enough to be careful? We are quick to demand understanding for ourselves, and quick to deny it to others. So what are you really responsible for? Only what you intended, only what you can explain, or everything that comes out of your actions, whether you like it or not. Responsibility, if taken seriously, doesn't feel fair, because it means you're accountable for effects you didn't foresee, for harm you didn't want, and for pain you might not even understand. That's the illusion. That morality lives in your head. It doesn't. It lives in the wreckage you leave behind. You are always going to regret it. Regret feels like choice, like you did something wrong and wish you hadn't. But if you had no real choice, then regret isn't reflection. It's punishment. And you're punishing yourself for something you were never free to avoid. This is the disturbing logic at the center of deterministic regret. If the universe is governed by cause and effect, then everything you've ever done, every decision, every failure, every cruelty was inevitable. Regret is not a sign of moral growth. It's just you becoming aware of the outcome after the fact. You say you should have chosen differently. But how? You didn't choose your personality. You didn't choose your fears. You didn't choose your impulses. You didn't choose your past. Your brain reacted based on a chain of conditions you didn't create. and the moment happened, and now you regret it. But regret isn't freedom. It's just suffering without power. Worse, it disguises itself as virtue. You think feeling bad makes you better. That guilt means you care. That remorse is a sign of conscience. But if regret is just hindsight on a predetermined path, then it's not character. It's confusion. You're grieving something that was never avoidable. So what do you do with that? Do you keep reliving the memory? Keep rewriting the moment in your head? Keep whispering, "I should have known," to yourself at 3 a.m.? You couldn't have. Because if you could have known, you would have. If you could have done better, you would have. But you didn't. And there's only one explanation in a deterministic universe. You weren't capable in that moment. Not yet. Not then. That's not forgiveness. It's worse. It's the realization that everything you've ever blamed yourself for was just the only thing that could have happened. And you're blaming the weather for being cloudy. Regret assumes control. But if control was missing, regret becomes a glitch, a feature of human consciousness that thinks it's driving the car when it's really just watching the road through a cracked windshield. You think you're moral because you feel regret. But what if that's just a delay in understanding the script? Every regret you have is a memory of power you never possessed. And if you keep treating it like a moral failure, you're going to keep drowning in shame over something that wasn't a choice. You were always going to make that mistake. You were always going to hurt them. You were always going to fail there. And you were always going to regret it. But that doesn't mean it mattered. The lie of shared reality. You think we're living in the same world, seeing the same things, interpreting the same facts. But that belief, shared reality, is a comfortable illusion. And the more you look for it, the more you realize it may never have existed. Everyone thinks they're being reasonable. Everyone thinks they're seeing what's really happening. And everyone thinks the people who disagree are misinformed, brainwashed, or lying. But maybe they're not. Maybe their reality is different because their brain, their experiences, their wiring, and their trauma force it to be. This is the core of epistemic isolation, the breakdown of the idea that we're all operating in a single, unified version of truth. We're not. We never were. We just overlapped enough to fake it. Now, with the internet, with algorithmic echo chambers, with tailored content, with personalized beliefs, we don't even pretend to share truth anymore. We scroll in worlds that look identical on the surface, but run on entirely different logic underneath. And we still think the other side is wrong. That's the trap. Everyone is staring into the same light, but each of them sees a different color. And each is convinced the others are delusional. This isn't just political or cultural. It's neurological. Human perception isn't passive. It's active construction. Your brain doesn't record reality. It edits, deletes, adds, interprets, colors, fills in blanks. Every memory you have is partially fiction. Every belief you hold is filtered through invisible bias. So what happens when someone disagrees with you? You assume they're dishonest, or irrational, or dangerous. But what if they're just running a different simulation? What if they're not crazy, but just trapped in a mental architecture you'll never access? Now stretch that. What if you are the one misreading the signals? What if you're the one living in the warped mirror, and they're just trying to make sense of your reflection? There's no way to test this. There's no neutral ground to stand on. There's no cosmic camera that shows you the unfiltered feed. We're all staring through stained glass, convinced it's transparent. And the more we try to convince each other, the more we realize we're not arguing over facts. We're arguing over foundations. That's what makes this puzzle terrifying. There may be no shared world left, only collisions between realities that can't merge. And if that's true, communication is not dialogue. It's translation between hallucinations. The identity swap no one notices. You assume you're the same person who woke up this morning. But how do you know? Not just that you remember waking up. Memory can be faked. That your body feels familiar. Bodies change. That your name is the same. Names can be reassigned. What exactly makes you still you? and not a replacement who simply believes they're you. This is the horror buried in continuity without proof, that your experience of being yourself could be copied, overwritten, or rebooted, and you wouldn't know. Because the part of you that would question it is already built to believe in its own consistency. There's no alarm that rings if your identity is replaced. There's no built-in defense. All that matters is that the machine says, yes, I am me. But what if the machine isn't you anymore? Philosophers call this the problem of indistinguishable continuity. The idea that if you were perfectly swapped, if your consciousness was uploaded, duplicated, or even just reconstructed in a slightly different format, you'd keep going without ever realizing you've been replaced. Because you is just the illusion of unbroken experience. And illusions don't question themselves. This isn't science fiction. It's already baked into your biology. Your body replaces its cells. Your brain rewires its circuits. Your memories change every time you recall them. The you from 10 years ago is gone chemically, neurologically, and psychologically. So what's left? A story. One that says, I've always been me. But stories are easy to forge. And here's the terrifying part. Even if your consciousness was swapped at some point, you wouldn't know. And no one around you would notice. Because the body walks, the mouth talks, the system loops, and the people around you treat the surface like the core. But the core might be gone. Maybe it vanished in your sleep. Maybe it glitched out during trauma. Maybe it never existed in the first place. And you're just the most recent layer pretending to be a foundation. Every morning, you wake up and reboot. And every morning, the thing that boots up just says, yep, still me. But maybe it's not. Maybe you were replaced 1,000 times. And the only thing left is the echo. You don't know what you believe. You think you believe what you say you believe. But that's a guess. Most people don't believe what they think. They believe what they feel safe believing. What rewards them socially. What fits their identity. What keeps them connected to the tribe. Truth isn't the filter. Comfort is. This is the brutal insight behind belief camouflage. Your beliefs are not selected for accuracy. They're selected for survival. You don't hold them because they're true. You hold them because they keep you from being abandoned, attacked, or ignored. You believe in honesty until honesty threatens your social standing. You believe in kindness until kindness makes you look weak. You believe in reason until reason forces you to dismantle something sacred. Then the belief bends, morphs, justifies itself. And you don't call it hypocrisy. You call it nuance. But the truth is more disturbing. You don't know what's real and what's performative anymore. Because belief isn't just intellectual. It's chemical, emotional, tribal, conditional. You're more likely to shift your opinion if someone attractive says the opposite than if someone intelligent does. That's not a flaw. That's the architecture. And once you realize that, belief becomes dangerous. Because every time you defend something, you have to ask, do I actually believe this? Or do I just not want to lose something by letting it go? How many of your core principles are just self-protection in costume? How many of your deepest truths are just inherited defaults you never dared challenge? You don't have to be lying to believe a lie. You just have to be rewarded for believing it. And if the people around you are nodding, if your worldview is never tested, if your beliefs are never punished, then you might never find out which of them are real. The ones that are left when they cost you everything, those are your beliefs. The rest is theater. Nothing you think is private. You believe your thoughts belong to you. That the mind is the one place left untouched, sacred, silent, sealed off from the world. That no one can reach into it, change it, or even fully understand it. But what if that feeling itself is the product of the same forces you think you're hiding from? The truth is, your mind didn't form in isolation. It was built through exposure, repetition, and imitation. From the very beginning, language wasn't yours. The words you used to think were given to you. The categories you divide the world into good and bad, right and wrong, normal and deviant, were installed before you ever asked where they came from. And because they arrived early and arrived everywhere, you stopped noticing they were foreign. You started calling them natural. You called them truth. Now you move through life assuming your thoughts are yours because they feel familiar. But familiarity isn't ownership. It's just repetition. The more you repeat something, the more it feels like it belongs. But repetition is also the foundation of indoctrination. And that means the core of your inner life. The thing you guard the most might be the most successfully colonized space of all. Even your fantasies are not exempt. You think you desire freely, but desire is shaped. You were taught what's attractive. You were fed stories about what success looks like. What kind of life is worth admiring? What kind of people deserve affection? The ideas that make you feel special, ashamed, driven, or defective didn't emerge from nowhere. They were curated, and over time, they became self-sustaining. You don't need to be watched. You've internalized the eyes. You enforce the rules without knowing where they came from. This is the terrifying part. Even when you rebel, even when you break away, even when you claim you're thinking for yourself, you may still be following a map someone else drew. You might be operating in a framework that was never of your choosing. Because escaping the system doesn't mean you've left it. It may just mean it gave you a different costume to wear. You tell yourself that your mind is your last refuge, that your memories are sacred, your preferences authentic, your inner voice uniquely yours. But that voice speaks the language it was taught. It uses ideas handed down by the very structures you thought you'd outgrown. The walls of your mind may look like freedom, but they were designed by someone else, and you're walking in circles inside them. So the next time you sit alone and think, at least this moment is private, ask yourself, is it really? Or are you just rehearsing beliefs that were planted so early, so deeply, that you forgot to be suspicious of them? Maybe your thoughts aren't hidden. Maybe they were never yours. Maybe the deepest parts of your mind are just the most successfully programmed. You were never the one acting. You live under the impression that you are the source of your actions, that when you move, speak, decide, or resist, the origin is inside you, that there is a you making things happen. But when you look closely, when you trace any moment of behavior back far enough, the idea of agency starts to disintegrate. You react to what's around you. You respond to stimuli. You follow patterns. Even your most deliberate choices arise from a long chain of influences that you did not choose. You wake up and feel irritated, or calm, or determined, without knowing why. Hormones shift. Memories resurface. External stressors apply pressure. And something inside you moves. Not because you wanted it to, but because it had to. You say yes to things you later regret. You lash out when you promised yourself you'd stay calm. You isolate when you know you need connection. These aren't mysteries. They're predictable reactions inside a system. Your nervous system is responding to a threat. Your emotions are pulling you away from perceived pain. Your habits are conserving energy. At no point did a separate, sovereign you step in to override it all with pure will. The system just did what it was wired to do. And this wiring isn't just biology. It's personal history. If your childhood was chaotic, your brain learned to scan for danger. If your environment was unpredictable, your body learned to overcontrol. If you were punished for honesty, you learned to speak carefully, even when no one's watching. These adaptations live under your conscious awareness, but they drive your actions. You think you're choosing, but you're reacting. Even your moments of reflection, when you pause and analyze yourself, those too are reactions. To guilt, to uncertainty, to the threat of shame. Your introspection is not a higher function floating above the system. It's the system responding to internal discomfort by trying to regain control. And sometimes, it works. You feel empowered. You feel like you decided something. But the system wanted relief, and you gave it what it asked for. So who's in charge? If every action is a response to an internal or external condition, if every condition is shaped by forces beyond your control, If even your desire to take responsibility is a programmed feature of your nervous system trying to feel safe, then who exactly is the actor? You think you're the origin, but you're the result. You are not the one doing. You're what gets done. The self-improvement paradox. You want to be better, smarter, kinder, more disciplined, less reactive. You want to grow, and you believe that growth is something you can control, something you can force through effort and intention. But what if even your desire to improve is just another product of the system you're trapped in? This is the paradox. The impulse to improve yourself may not be a sign of freedom. It may be a symptom of deeper programming, one that tells you you're never enough, that there's always a version of you just out of reach, more worthy, more acceptable, more valuable, and so you chase it. But here's the problem. Every step toward improvement also reinforces the belief that you are, by default, flawed. You're trying to escape yourself by using yourself as the tool. But if the instrument is damaged, how can it fix itself? You wake up feeling unproductive. So you punish yourself with stricter discipline. You feel emotionally reactive, so you drown in self-analysis. You feel lost, so you binge personal development content, hoping that more insight will finally make the discomfort go away. But what if it doesn't? What if the discomfort is built into the system? Because the idea of self-improvement assumes there's a stable, consistent self underneath all the behavior. But there isn't. What you changes depending on mood, context, memory, biology, and perception. So which version are you trying to improve? And who decides when you're finally good enough? The deeper you go, the worse it gets. Even the motivation to change yourself often comes from shame, from comparison, from survival instinct. You want to become something else because you've been conditioned to believe that this version of you is not worthy, not lovable, not successful enough. And so, you turn your life into a project. But when is the project finished? No one tells you, because improvement never ends. There's always another flaw, another habit, another mindset to correct. You start running toward an ideal self who keeps moving further away. And every failure to reach her reinforces the belief that you need more fixing. That's not growth. That's a loop. You're trying to solve the feeling of inadequacy by becoming adequate. But the pursuit itself keeps you convinced that you aren't there yet, that you must keep going. That piece is just one more breakthrough away. So you keep building yourself. But maybe you're just building a prison made of effort. The myth of emotional honesty. You're told to speak your truth, to feel your feelings, to express what's inside without shame. Emotional honesty is treated like a virtue, pure, courageous, authentic. But what if it's not? What if your emotions don't tell the truth at all? Your feelings feel real, immediate, visceral, but that doesn't make them accurate. Emotions are interpretations. They're based on assumptions, predictions, memories, and bias. When you feel rejected, you assume someone meant to exclude you. When you feel unsafe, you assume there's real danger. When you feel angry, you assume someone violated you. But what if they didn't? Your nervous system doesn't need evidence. It just needs patterns. It detects something familiar, then floods you with a feeling. Not because the situation is the same, but because it feels the same. And once the feeling lands, your brain starts building a story to justify it. That story becomes your version of honesty. But it might be fiction. Think about how many times you've felt abandoned when someone just needed space. How many times you've felt disrespected when no harm was intended. How often your tears or silence were based on misread signals, old wounds, or simple exhaustion. But in the moment, it felt like truth, because the emotion showed up, and you believed it. Now here's the trap. The more you identify with your emotions, the more you protect them. And once protected, they become sacred. Criticizing them feels like invalidation. Questioning them feels like betrayal. So you double down. You start believing that because you felt it, it must be real. But reality doesn't owe you that kind of symmetry. Just because an emotion is strong doesn't mean it's grounded. You might be screaming about something that never happened. You might be shutting someone out for a crime they didn't commit. You might be destroying relationships over patterns your body is reacting to, not because of the present, but because of what the past taught you to expect. That's not honesty. That's misfired defense. And if you base your identity around emotional truth, you become unteachable. No one can challenge your reaction without being seen as invalidating. No one can point out the gap between what happened and how you felt without becoming the enemy. Because to you, emotion equals evidence. But it doesn't. You can feel something deeply and still be wrong. You can speak your truth, and that truth can be a story your body invented to protect you. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But if you want to be honest, really honest, you have to go deeper than how you feel. You have to ask what those feelings are protecting, and whether the thing they're defending even exists anymore. The illusion of knowing yourself. You believe you know who you are. You've lived with yourself your entire life. You've watched your thoughts, tracked your behaviors, remembered your past, listened to your feelings, and from that pile of information, you've created a narrative, a story called me. But what if that story is wrong? Worse, what if it's not even yours? You think of yourself as consistent. But consistency is an illusion built on memory, and memory is unreliable. You remember what your brain lets you remember. You forget what it decides to protect you from. You edit your experiences without knowing. You invent reasons for your behavior that aren't real, and your mind accepts them because they feel plausible. You say, "I'm just the kind of person who." But where did that sentence come from? A childhood role? A cultural label? A trauma you stopped questioning? The personality you identify with might be a survival structure you mistook for a soul. You think you're honest about yourself, but honesty requires objectivity, and you can't be objective about the thing that feels like you. Everything you experience is filtered through that lens. If you're insecure, you filter the world through perceived rejection. If you're proud, you filter it through confirmation. If you're ashamed, everything starts to look like punishment. So even your self-awareness isn't clean. It's distorted, but it gets worse because you change, slowly, without asking. You believe the things you swore you never would. You adopt ideas you once ridiculed. You forget dreams that once defined you. You adjust your morality to match your environment, and you call it growth. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just erosion dressed up as maturity. And you almost never notice it while it's happening. The you who made a decision 10 years ago would barely recognize the you who justifies it now. But you still pretend it's all one self, one continuous thread, because the alternative, that you're a sequence of temporary selves wearing the same name, feels unbearable. So you stitch the story together. You rationalize the gaps. You invent stability. You cling to identity not because it's accurate, but because it's comforting. It helps you face the mirror. But what if the mirror is lying? What if your self-image is a mask, built for safety, shaped by necessity, and updated for social acceptance? And what if the real you, if there is one, has never had the chance to speak? Knowing yourself is one of the highest ideals in modern life. But most people never even get close. Not because they're dishonest, but because the tool they're using to find themselves is the very thing they're trying to observe. You can't study the system from inside the system. And that means you might live your whole life convinced you understand yourself, while everything you've built that belief on is quietly false. The trap of being understood. You think you want to be understood, to be seen, to be known in a way that feels complete, deep, and honest. You search for it in love, in friendship, in family, in words. You try to explain yourself, what you feel, what you've been through, what you believe. And when someone gets close, it feels like relief, like home. But what if the desire to be understood is itself a trap? Because to be understood, you have to be explainable. You have to flatten yourself into something someone else can recognize. You have to turn the chaos inside you into a story that makes sense to them. And that process, no matter how honest, always involves distortion. You leave things out. You simplify. You translate your feelings into language that can't carry them. You censor thoughts that sound wrong. You perform coherence. And what they understand is a version of you. But it's not all of you. You feel that gap, even when they love you. They hold your hand and say they know you, and you smile. But part of you knows it's not entirely true. Because what they love isn't exactly what you are. It's what they can access, what they can comprehend, what you were able to give them. And maybe that's no one's fault. But it means that even in your closest moments, a part of you remains alone. So you try again. You get better at expressing. You become more articulate, more vulnerable. You share more. But as your communication improves, your loneliness doesn't always shrink. Because being seen is not the same as being met. You can be perfectly visible and still feel invisible inside. This is where the trap tightens. The more you crave understanding, the more power you give away. Because now you depend on someone else to confirm your reality. You wait for them to reflect you back to yourself. And when they don't or can't, you begin to doubt what you feel. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm too much. Maybe I don't make sense. Maybe I need to explain better. But maybe the problem isn't you. Maybe the problem is that human experience is fundamentally incommunicable. That language can't carry what consciousness contains. That being truly known is an illusion we chase to feel less alone. And so we tell our stories again and again, hoping someone hears the part we couldn't say. Sometimes they do. Most of the time, they don't. And we nod, and we smile, and we say, "Thanks for understanding." But inside, we know no one can fully see us. Because the parts that need to be seen the most are the ones no one has the tools to look at. The lie of deserving. You were taught to believe that effort leads to reward. That if you try hard, stay good, make sacrifices, and push through pain, you'll eventually get what you deserve. You were told the world is hard, but fair. That justice is slow, but real. That life, in the long run, balances out. But what if it doesn't? What if deserving has nothing to do with anything? You've seen people who gave everything and still lost. People who were honest and ended up betrayed. People who were kind and got crushed. You've seen talent go unnoticed, love go unreciprocated, and hard work go unrewarded. And you've seen others cheat, lie, hurt, manipulate, and win. Not occasionally, regularly, over and over again. And you still think it's about merit? The idea of deserving feels necessary because without it, life seems chaotic. It becomes terrifying to accept that outcomes are often random, or rigged, or governed by variables you don't control. So we invent a story. If I keep doing the right thing, things will eventually work out. But that's not a law. That's a hope. And when the world violates it, we don't stop believing. We just blame ourselves. Maybe I didn't try hard enough. Maybe I didn't manifest it correctly. Maybe I wasn't positive enough, humble enough, pure enough. You turn suffering into a personal failing instead of recognizing that the system itself is indifferent. Deserving implies a moral economy. But nature doesn't reward goodness. It rewards survival. And society doesn't reward virtue. It rewards usefulness, conformity, sometimes luck. If you happen to align with what the world values right now, you rise. If not, you don't. It's not personal. It just feels like it is. This doesn't mean you stop trying, but it means you stop expecting fairness as a built-in feature of the universe. It means realizing that pain and effort don't entitle you to results. That love doesn't guarantee reciprocation. That justice isn't a cosmic principle. It's a social construct. Inconsistently applied, you can give your whole heart and still lose. You can build something beautiful and watch it fall. And it won't be because you did something wrong. It'll be because outcomes are not tied to effort in the way you've been told. So when you fail, or get hurt, or watch someone worse than you succeed, don't ask why it's unfair. Ask why you believed it ever had to be fair in the first place. Maybe life isn't about what you deserve. Maybe it never was. The personality you think you have doesn't exist. You describe yourself in certain ways. You say you're introverted, or intense, or relaxed, or independent. You believe you have a personality, a consistent identity that you carry with you from one situation to the next. Something stable, something real. But what if that's just another illusion? Psychologists call it the personality coherence myth. The idea that we're the same person across time and context is not supported by behavior. The truth is, you change depending on who you're with, where you are, how you're feeling, and what role you're unconsciously playing in the moment. You act confident in one group and shy in another. You're disciplined on some days and impulsive on others. You can be warm, cold, selfish, generous, arrogant, gentle, all in the span of a week. And yet you still say, "That's not like me," when you act outside the version of yourself you've committed to in your mind. But what if that version is just the highlight reel? What if you're not oneself, but many? Your so-called personality may just be the average of your responses under familiar conditions. When those conditions change, so do you. You think you're consistent, but what you're really doing is creating consistency through selective memory. You forget the contradictions. You downplay the moments that don't fit the narrative. You protect the identity you've built, even if it's incomplete. And here's the hard part: if you're not fixed, then the idea of being true to yourself becomes complicated. Which self? The one who wants stability or the one who craves change? The one who wants love or the one who runs from it? The one who wakes up early and works hard or the one who sabotages everything at 2 a.m.? You're not a personality. You're a pattern of reactions, a dynamic system, a self-reinforcing loop of beliefs, emotions, habits, and adaptations. And that system can shift dramatically based on something as small as a conversation, a memory, a scent, a loss. It's comforting to believe in a fixed self. It gives you something to defend, something to grow, something to find. But the more you cling to it, the more distorted your view becomes. Because you'll spend more time trying to protect who you think you are than honestly observing what you actually do. Maybe the real you isn't a solid structure. Maybe it's a moving target. The choice you think you made was already decided. You think you made a choice. You thought about your options. You weighed the pros and cons. You hesitated, considered, chose. It felt deliberate, intentional, yours. But what if that's only how it felt? Most decisions aren't born from clarity. They emerge from pressure, emotional, social, biological, historical. A situation arises. You react. You justify. Then you narrate that reaction as a decision. You chose to stay in the relationship, but only because your fear of abandonment was louder than your discomfort. You chose the job, but only because the risk of failure scared you more than the pain of boredom. You chose to forgive, but maybe it wasn't forgiveness, it was fatigue. And the disturbing part is, you often don't realize this until much later. You look back at your decisions and see how reactive they were. How much of them came from conditioning, from unresolved pain, from inherited beliefs, from survival patterns. Your body makes half the decisions before your mind catches up. Your nervous system votes before you do, and your brain writes the story afterward to make it all look coherent. So where is the choice? We like to believe that decisions are moments of clarity, but most of them are just paths of least resistance, dressed in the language of purpose. You weren't pulled toward something. You were pushed by something older, deeper, harder to name. You can tell yourself that you decided. But the truth is, the choice was probably made for you by your chemistry, your trauma, your culture, your family, your fears, and you didn't choose those things. They built you before you were even aware. And once they shaped you, they shaped the options you'd find acceptable, the risks you'd avoid, the comforts you'd chase, the people you'd trust, the versions of success you'd pursue. So when you finally choose, you're choosing between options that your system already filtered for you. That's not freedom. That's selection inside a cage. You still live with the consequences. You still feel the outcomes. But the idea that you were fully in charge of that moment, that's a story you tell yourself so you can sleep at night. Because if you admit how little control you had, you'd have to question everything you've ever called a choice. And most people aren't ready for that. The mirror doesn't show you. You've looked in the mirror thousands of times. You see a face you recognize, a body you identify as your own. You call that your image, your presence, and you assume that what you see is what others see. But that's not how it works. The mirror doesn't show you. It shows something else, something filtered, reversed, and most importantly, incomplete. What others see when they look at you is not what you see in the mirror. You've never seen your real facial expressions. You've never watched yourself mid-conversation, from the outside. You've never truly observed how your presence affects a room. What you see in the mirror is static, controlled, chosen. But that's not who you are in motion, and it's not who you are in memory. Even worse, the mirror lies gently. It reflects only what your eyes can tolerate. You grow used to the image. You interpret it through habit and self-narrative. You don't see the subtle ways you've aged, the ways your posture has changed, the tiny signs of emotional exhaustion. But other people do. They notice things you don't, because they're not looking through the same protective filters you are. Now take that further. If your mirror image is partial, and the social image others have of you is fragmented and inconsistent, and your internal self-image is based on memory and bias, then what version of you is actually real? Is it the one you see, the one they see, or the one you imagine yourself to be? Each version contradicts the others. You might think you're composed, while others see you as cold. You might think you're funny, while others see you as obnoxious. You might think you're invisible, while others are quietly intimidated. None of those perceptions are lies, but none of them are complete. That's the trap. You assume there's a core version of you, a stable self beneath all these reflections. But every attempt to capture it results in distortion. And the more you try to control your image, the more you become a manager of perception instead of a person with presence. The truth is, you've never actually seen yourself the way the world sees you. And you never will. Because perception isn't a mirror. It's a system of projections, yours and theirs. And in between all those projections, the real you, if it exists, remains hidden. Not because it's deep, but because it was never something visible to begin with. Your memories are not yours. You trust your memories. They tell you who you are, where you've been, what you've survived, what you value. They're the record of your life, the internal archive you return to in moments of doubt. But what if that archive is corrupted? What if it always was? Memory is not a recording. It's not stored and replayed. It's recreated every time you recall it. Each time you think of a moment, your brain pulls together pieces, images, emotions, fragments, and rebuilds the experience like a puzzle. But each rebuild introduces error. You exaggerate. You simplify. You misplace. And over time, the original moment is lost beneath layers of reassembled versions. Worse, your memories are influenced by your current emotional state. If you feel confident, you remember yourself as more competent in the past. If you feel ashamed, you recall yourself as foolish or weak, even when you weren't. Your present corrupts your past, silently and repeatedly. And it doesn't stop there. Other people shape your memories too. Their retellings, their reactions, their versions of the story begin to overwrite yours. You remember things you never actually experienced. You forget things that did happen. You adopt narratives that make sense socially, even if they're wrong. So what exactly is being remembered? You think your memories are yours. But much of what you recall is reconstructed from cultural fragments, emotional overlays, borrowed language, and unconscious edits. You remember what fits your identity. You delete what threatens it. You hold on to what justifies your behavior and forget what contradicts it. Even your most painful memories are not immune. Trauma doesn't make memory clearer. It often makes it worse. Memories become frozen, distorted, or split into pieces that don't connect. And when you try to talk about them, you often shape the retelling to make it bearable or make it make sense. But real memory isn't about sense. It's about impact. And impact doesn't always match the facts. So you live your life based on a personal history that is constantly shifting, and you believe it's stable. You make decisions about who to love, who to avoid, what to pursue, based on a story that may not even be true. Not because you're lying, but because the truth is too unstable to stand on. The voice in your head isn't you. You think you're the one narrating your life. That little voice, the one that judges, doubts, plans, replays, is familiar, intimate. It sounds like you. It uses your language. It references your fears. So it must be you. But what if it isn't? What if that voice is just a function, like digestion or reflex? What if it's not a self, but a system? You don't choose its tone. Sometimes it comforts. Sometimes it destroys. You don't choose when it speaks. It interrupts sleep. It hijacks joy. It loops on pain. It tells you stories about your worth, your future, your relationships, and you listen because it sounds internal. But it might not be truth. It might not even be sane. That voice is built from inputs, childhood scripts, parental phrasing, cultural rules, bullies, praise, fear. The way you talk to yourself is often a remix of how the world talked to you. And once that voice took shape, it didn't stop. It became automatic. And now it runs without your consent. You argue with it. You try to silence it. But its power doesn't come from truth. It comes from repetition. The more it speaks, the more real it feels. And because it feels real, you treat it as authority. You believe it when it says you're behind, that you'll never be loved, that everyone else has figured it out, that you need to do more, be more, hurry up, or shut down. But here's the trap. When you believe the voice is you, you can't challenge it. Because how do you fight yourself? That's the illusion. You're not the voice. You're the awareness of it, the one hearing it speak, the one asking where it came from. And once you realize that, the voice loses power, not because it goes silent, but because you stop mistaking it for identity. It will still talk, but you don't have to follow. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of being human is not what happens to us, but the voice that keeps explaining it afterward. You don't know when you're lying. You think lies are conscious, that they're deliberate, that when someone lies, they know it. But the truth is far more complicated and far more disturbing. You can lie without knowing. You can believe things that aren't true, not because you're deceived, but because your mind finds the lie more livable than the truth. Most people assume they value truth, but the brain doesn't prioritize truth. It prioritizes coherence. It prefers a stable story over a correct one. If a fact threatens your identity, your relationships, your past decisions, your mind starts rewriting it, not with malicious intent, but with subtle adjustment. You minimize, you reframe, you redirect, and it feels natural. It feels honest. That's the danger. You don't always lie with words. You lie with silence, with omission, with posture, with denial, with agreement you didn't mean, with a smile that hides collapse. And the more you repeat those moments, the more you believe them, until you no longer remember what the real feeling was. You just remember the version that worked better. And then you tell that version to others. You tell it to yourself. You tell it so often it becomes the official story. Not because you're manipulative, because your mind needed a version of events that hurt less. But what you're left with is something worse than a lie. It's a lie you can no longer see. You can walk through entire relationships based on these invisible distortions. You can love someone because it's safe, not because it's true. You can stay in a job because the lie of stability is easier than the truth of stagnation. You can call yourself healed when you're still bleeding. And everyone around you will believe you because the performance looks close enough to conviction. So what's real? You might think truth is something you discover, but often, it's something you uncover, layer by layer. underneath the stories you didn't know you were telling. The question isn't whether you lie. It's how many of those lies you've mistaken for reality. You've never actually seen the world. You open your eyes and believe you're seeing reality, that what's in front of you is what's there. That perception equals truth. But the human brain doesn't work like a camera. It doesn't record. It interprets. It guesses. It edits. What you're seeing isn't the world. It's a model your brain creates in real time, a hallucination guided by limited input. The eyes don't see everything. They pick up a narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. They ignore ultraviolet, infrared, and most of what light actually contains. The brain fills in blind spots. It stabilizes motion. It smooths over flickering. You think you're watching the world as it is, but what you're really seeing is a stabilized, color-enhanced, language-bound rendering. Even the objects you interact with don't exist the way you think. There's no color in the external world, only wavelengths. There's no sound, only vibrations. Your brain translates those inputs into experiences. But the experiences don't live outside your skull. Take that further. What if every perception, every shape, face, room, sky, is just your brain's best guess at what might be there, based on probability and memory? What you call real is a simulation so well designed that you stopped questioning it. And the design isn't neutral. It's shaped by evolution. Your visual field evolved for survival, not truth. You see edges because edges matter when hunting. You detect faces and patterns because failing to recognize a predator had consequences. What you perceive is what kept your ancestors alive, not what actually exists. So when you walk through the world and say, "I saw it with my own eyes," what you really mean is, "My brain generated a version of reality that felt good enough to trust." But if perception is constructed, and construction is fallible, then the most basic assumption you make every second, that you are seeing the world, is flawed. You're not seeing the world. You're seeing a guess. Most of what you do is to avoid a feeling. You tell yourself you have goals, that you make decisions based on logic, values, or long-term thinking, that your actions are strategic. But dig deeper, and you'll find a simpler, more uncomfortable motive. You're just trying to avoid feeling something. Most of what you do, working late, checking your phone, arguing, staying in bed, exercising, numbing out, isn't driven by what you want. It's driven by what you don't want to feel. Guilt, shame, boredom, rejection, helplessness, disappointment, inadequacy. You move through the day dodging them like landmines, and you call it purpose. This doesn't mean your goals are fake. It means the fuel behind them is fear. You study not because you love learning, but because you can't tolerate the feeling of failure. You strive for success not because you need achievement, but because you're terrified of being ordinary. You scroll for hours not because you're entertained, but because sitting with your thoughts feels unbearable. And these behaviors work. They regulate emotion. They dull the discomfort, but they also trap you. Because if your life is designed around emotional avoidance, then every decision you make reinforces your fear. You never learn that you can survive rejection. You just build your world to prevent it. You never discover that boredom passes. You just fill the silence faster. And over time, your avoidance becomes identity. You call yourself a perfectionist, a workaholic, a procrastinator, a people pleaser. But underneath every label is the same engine, a feeling you never wanted to feel. The tragedy is that you forget what actual freedom feels like. Because freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's being able to feel discomfort without running from it, without numbing, performing, avoiding, or explaining it away. But that kind of freedom takes something brutal, sitting still and letting the feeling land. And most people never do. Because the moment the discomfort rises, the system kicks in, and you call that impulse a decision. But it's not. It's escape. Progress doesn't mean direction. You've been told that progress is movement. That as long as you're going forward, learning, achieving, healing, you're becoming more, better, smarter, stronger. That with enough time and effort, life begins to make sense. But what if that idea is completely wrong? Progress implies direction. It assumes that the path you're on has a shape, a goal, a final version of yourself waiting somewhere in the future. But most of the time, that direction is made up. You're not following a map. You're just reacting to the last thing that happened. You call it growth, but it might be adaptation. You bend yourself around failure and call it wisdom. You recover from a mistake and call it maturity. You survive something painful and say you've evolved. But maybe you didn't evolve. Maybe you just got tired, or careful, or numb. And if you think that sounds cynical, look closer. You say you've changed. But changed into what? What defines better? Who decides what qualifies as growth? Most of what we call progress is just shifting priorities. New fears replacing old ones. New coping mechanisms replacing outdated ones. We mistake compensation for evolution. You were more confident when you knew less. Then life happened. You got quieter, less certain, more defensive, and now you call that humility. But maybe it's just the residue of experience, less clarity, more hesitation. You start doing less, saying less, needing less, and the world claps and calls it discipline. But maybe it's just disillusionment with the things you used to want. This is the trap. Every shift looks like growth if you frame it the right way. You can be running in circles, calling it progress, because it feels exhausting enough to be real. But motion isn't proof of direction. Struggle isn't proof of meaning. Accumulation isn't proof of development. Progress has become a moral label. If you're not moving forward, people assume you're failing, or stuck, or broken. But what if standing still is sometimes the most honest thing you can do? The world tells you to keep going. But if you're going in the wrong direction, that's not noble. That's denial. So maybe the question isn't whether you're progressing. Maybe it's whether you ever knew where you were going in the first place. You're only listening to what you already agree with. You think you're open-minded, that you're capable of hearing new perspectives, learning new truths, being challenged. But most of what you hear, you filter. Most of what you read, you skim for confirmation. Most of what you absorb, you already believe. Your brain is not designed for objective learning. It's designed for cognitive efficiency. That means preserving the worldview you already have. You listen for familiar patterns. You look for agreeable conclusions. And when you encounter something that threatens your beliefs, your nervous system flinches. You get irritated, bored, dismissive, not because the argument is weak, but because your brain registered it as unsafe. This isn't just stubbornness. It's biology. Your identity is wired into your beliefs. If you let go of one, even temporarily, the rest begin to wobble. That's why changing your mind feels so threatening. It doesn't feel like an update. It feels like death. So instead, you surround yourself with content that reinforces you. You follow voices that validate your values. You admire thinkers who say what you already feel. You consume perspectives that sharpen your existing conclusions. And you call that growth. But it's not growth if the root structure never changes. It's not learning if every new idea has to pass your internal loyalty test. It's not dialogue if you're only waiting for the moment to say exactly. You can listen to something for an hour and not hear a word of it. You can read an entire book and retain only the parts that confirm what you already thought. You can have conversations that feel deep, but never touch the fragile beliefs hiding underneath your persona. And here's the trap. The smarter you are, the better you get at justifying this. You build complex arguments to support your identity. You cherry-pick data with elegance. You win debates and lose self-awareness. Real listening isn't passive. It's violent. It breaks things. It shatters assumptions. It creates confusion. If that's not happening, you're not listening. You're protecting something. And most people spend their whole lives mistaking reinforcement for wisdom. You're not escaping. You're just delaying the cost. You think you're coping, managing, moving on. You think the habits you've built, working harder, staying busy, staying distracted, are helping you survive. And maybe they are. But surviving and escaping are not the same. One helps you breathe. The other just moves the pain into storage. Every time you avoid a conversation, you're not escaping the discomfort. You're placing it on a shelf with interest. Every time you numb with food, screens, shopping, noise, you're not avoiding the feeling. You're pushing it into your future self's body. And one day, she'll wake up with the debt. Delayed pain doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes fatigue, resentment, lack of motivation. It becomes emotional distance you don't understand. It becomes chronic tension in your jaw. It becomes panic attacks that show up when nothing's wrong. It becomes difficulty trusting people for reasons you can't name. You tell yourself you've moved on, but your nervous system hasn't. Your memory hasn't. The part of you that felt unseen, rejected, humiliated, it's still there, just quieter. And every time you postpone the feeling, it grows teeth, because what you suppress becomes sharper, not softer. Avoidance doesn't equal healing. It just moves the wound out of sight. You think time is helping, but time only helps when it's filled with presence, with actual attention, with reckoning. Otherwise, time is just delay. You're not escaping. You're accumulating. And when the weight returns, and it will, you won't recognize it. You'll call it burnout. You'll call it emptiness. You'll say you lost yourself. But what really happened was simple. You kept paying with tomorrow for what you couldn't face today. And now the bill is due. The life you're living might be someone else's idea. You think your life is yours, that your preferences, your goals, your choices all reflect who you are. You assume that your path, however messy or unfinished, is at least something you shaped. But how much of it have you really chosen? Most of what you do comes from expectation. You work in a job that exists because someone decided that job should exist. You earn a salary that was set by systems you didn't design. You measure success by standards that were introduced to you before you could even understand what they meant. You celebrate when people tell you you're winning. You feel shame when people tell you you're behind. That's not self-direction. That's conditioning. You were born into a blueprint, a template of how life should look. School, work, relationships, property, productivity, retirement. You didn't build the structure. You just stepped into it. And every step you take inside that structure feels like a choice. But the map was handed to you long before you knew what choosing meant. Even your desires aren't untouched. What you want, security, admiration, beauty, status, has been shaped by advertising, culture, family, algorithms. You're told to find your passion, but your passions are often seeded by what the world rewards. You're told to be yourself, but the self you've become is largely a result of reinforcement. You became what got approval. So now you look at your life and wonder why it sometimes feels hollow, why it doesn't quite fit, why parts of it feel like performance, why certain milestones feel more like obligation than joy. And the answer might be this. You're living a version of life that wasn't designed with you in mind. It was built for control, continuity, compatibility, not for freedom. You might think you're making progress, but you're just leveling up in a game you never agreed to play. The rules were already set, and no matter how fast you run, you're still inside the maze. You're not doing what you want. You're doing what you were trained to want. And until you step back far enough to see the entire structure, you'll keep mistaking the cage for a path. You're not healing, you're repeating. You believe you're healing, that time is working, that you're getting better because things feel calmer now. You don't cry as often. You don't talk about it as much. You've started to function again. But functioning isn't healing, and calm doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it just means your system has learned how to suppress the noise. Healing isn't forgetting what happened. It's confronting what it did to you. But most people don't confront it. They avoid it. They find ways to adapt around it. They change behavior instead of exploring belief. They change environments instead of examining patterns. And the result is a life that looks different but feels eerily similar. You enter new relationships, but recreate the same dynamic. You take on new habits, but keep the same emotional hunger. You change jobs, cities, or identities, but the pain shows up again, in new clothes, and you call that progress. But maybe it's just repetition. Maybe what you're calling healing is just exhaustion. Maybe your system got tired of reacting, so it shut down. Maybe your silence isn't resolution. It's learned helplessness. You stopped trying to fix it because trying didn't work. So now you stay quiet and call it growth. You've convinced yourself that not feeling the pain means you're over it. But numbness isn't evidence. It's camouflage. And under that numbness, the wound might still be open. It just doesn't scream anymore. It whispers, in self-doubt, in defensiveness, in withdrawal, in over-explaining, in never trusting too much, in sabotaging anything that gets too close. This is the part no one talks about. You can be fully functional, entirely competent, emotionally intelligent, and still be deeply unhealed. Because healing isn't about performance. It's about contact. And that contact, direct, unfiltered, painful, is what most people spend their lives avoiding. So if you think you're healed because you don't feel broken anymore, ask yourself, are you healed? Or are you just better at hiding the damage? Your definition of love might be the reason you're unhappy. You say you want love, deep connection, intimacy, belonging. But what you want is shaped by how you first experienced love. And if that love was inconsistent, or conditional, or painful, then your definition of love might be quietly destroying you. You think of love as closeness, but maybe you equate closeness with intensity. You think of love as care, but maybe you learn that care looks like control. You think of love as safety, but maybe you only feel safe when you're needed, or admired, or forgiven. Your body remembers patterns long after your mind outgrows them. So you seek love, but you seek what's familiar, even if it hurt you, even if it failed you, even if it broke you, because familiar feels safe, and unfamiliar, even if it's healthier, feels cold. That's why healthy love sometimes feels boring, why calm affection feels distant, why steady support feels untrustworthy. You say you want stability, but when someone gives it to you, you flinch, because the love you learned didn't feel like this. And the nervous system doesn't trust what it hasn't had to survive. So you end up chasing emotional highs, misreading intensity as truth, mistaking anxiety for chemistry, confusing validation with connection, and then wondering why it never lasts, why it always ends in confusion, or silence, or pain. It's not because love is rare. It's because the version of love you're wired to seek is tied to a blueprint you never consciously approved. That blueprint was written by experience, by the emotional rewards and punishments you received early on, by how love was shown or withheld, by how safety was linked to performance, or submission, or silence. And unless you examine that blueprint, break it, rewrite it, you'll keep looking for a love that feels right and keeps hurting you. Sometimes you don't need a new partner or a new story. You need a new definition. What if your boundaries are just your fears in disguise? You say you're protecting your peace, that you've learned to say no, that you've built boundaries to keep yourself safe, healthy, and whole. But what if those boundaries aren't strength? What if they're just a sophisticated way to hide? Boundaries are supposed to be about clarity, about what you can handle, what's acceptable, what aligns with your values. But many boundaries aren't built on clarity. They're built on trauma, on fear, on wounds you've never fully named. You say you cut someone off because they were toxic, but maybe they just got close to a part of you you didn't want to examine. You say you need space, but maybe you just didn't want to risk being misunderstood again. You say you don't tolerate certain behaviors, but maybe those behaviors mirror things you haven't forgiven yourself for. The most dangerous boundaries are the ones that feel righteous, but are actually reactions. You call them choices, but they might be reflexes. And here's how you can tell. If a boundary is about creating more life, more safety, more connection, it's probably real. If it's about avoiding discomfort, escaping accountability, or controlling vulnerability. It's probably a mask. We don't build walls because we're strong. We build them because we've been invaded before. And if we don't realize what those walls are actually keeping out, we might spend our lives defending a version of ourselves that no longer exists. Boundaries aren't bad, but they're not always wise. They can calcify into personality traits. They can make you feel powerful while keeping you isolated. They can keep the past from repeating, but they can also keep healing from starting. You're not wrong for needing boundaries, but if you never revisit them, if you never ask where they came from, you might end up protecting yourself from things that were only dangerous in your memory. And that's not safety. That's self-erasure. What if you're not lonely, just disconnected from yourself? You keep saying you're lonely, that you miss people, that you crave connection. But what if the person you're really missing is you? Loneliness isn't always about physical absence. It's about disconnection. And disconnection doesn't just happen in relationships. It happens inside you. You drift from yourself, from your wants, from your reactions, from your pain. You forget how to check in. You forget how to answer. So you look outward. You think if someone else sees you, the feeling will go away. If someone understands you, texts you, loves you, you think their presence will make the ache inside you quiet down. But sometimes, even when they do all of that, it doesn't. You can be surrounded and still feel abandoned. You can be loved and still feel hollow. Because external connection can't fix internal absence. At some point, you stopped being honest with yourself. You filtered your feelings. You made your thoughts presentable. You censored your reactions. You punished your need. You buried your anger. You molded yourself into someone people could accept. And the version that remained, that's who you let the world love. But the part of you that didn't get to come out, that's the one who feels lonely. You're not missing company. You're missing access. And until you grant yourself permission to exist fully, not just the tidy parts, but the sharp, strange, shameful ones, you'll keep seeking connection through people who can't give it to you. Because how can anyone find you when even you don't know where you are? What if you're not confused, just finally seeing without illusion? You call it confusion, the sense of not knowing, the collapse of certainty, the hollow feeling in your stomach when nothing feels stable. You think you've lost your way. But maybe this isn't confusion. Maybe this is the first time you're seeing clearly, without the story. For most of your life, you were told what things meant, what success looked like, what love was supposed to feel like, what adulthood required, what being a good person meant. You absorbed the script. You rehearsed it. You lived by it. And every time you fell off, you blamed yourself for not fitting into it. But now the script is cracking. The words don't work anymore. The goals feel empty. The roles feel fake. The motivations feel hollow. And instead of calling that awakening, you call it confusion. You're not confused. You're unlearning. You're waking up from someone else's framework. And of course it feels disorienting. You don't have a replacement story yet. You don't have new meaning ready. All you have is silence, space, doubt. But that's not failure. That's freedom beginning. Because real clarity doesn't feel like a bright light. It feels like nothing. Like sitting in a room with no map, no voice, no purpose, and waiting, not for answers, but for the noise to settle so you can hear what was underneath all along. Confusion only feels scary when you think it means you've lost control. But what if it just means you've stopped pretending? What if it means the beliefs that kept you safe are no longer needed? What if your confusion is the first honest emotion you've had in years? What if your intelligence is just the ability to rationalize faster? You've been told you're smart. You analyze. You articulate. You see patterns. You solve problems. You ask questions. You assume that intelligence means you're closer to truth. That smarter people make better decisions. That understanding more protects you from being fooled. But what if intelligence isn't what you think? Smart people don't avoid bias. They just become better at defending it. Intelligence doesn't stop you from believing false things. It just gives you more sophisticated tools to argue for them. You know how to cherry-pick data. You know how to twist logic. You know how to build airtight narratives around deeply flawed beliefs and win debates with them. The more intelligent you are, the more tempting it becomes to believe your own conclusions, because they feel earned. But feeling earned doesn't make them accurate. In fact, intelligence often makes it harder to change your mind, because now your identity is built around being right. You're not just protecting a belief, you're protecting your sense of superiority. You become the architect of your own mental fortress. You insulate your worldview with research, citations, structured logic. You dismiss people who disagree with you as emotional, uninformed, irrational. But emotion isn't the enemy of truth, and rationality isn't its guarantee. Some of the most damaging people in history were brilliant. Some of the worst ideas were backed by impeccable reasoning. Intelligence, by itself, isn't wisdom. It's just firepower, and firepower can be aimed anywhere. You might think your thinking protects you, but it might just be protecting your blind spots. Every time you win an argument with yourself, you lose a chance to examine what you're defending. And over time, you stop learning. You start performing intelligence instead of using it. The smartest people aren't the ones with the best answers, but they're theons who never stop asking if their answers are even worth defending. What if you're only productive when you're disconnected from yourself? You feel proud when you're productive. You mark off tasks. You hit deadlines. You stay focused. You feel valuable. You feel strong. You tell yourself you're in control. But have you ever noticed that your most productive days are sometimes the ones when you feel the least human? You silence your hunger. You ignore your fatigue. You push through pain. You suppress the anxiety, the irritation, the aching sadness. You get it done, and everyone applauds. But no one notices that to become productive, you had to separate from yourself first. Most modern productivity doesn't reward self-connection. It rewards self-denial. The more you override your needs, the more efficient you seem. The less you pause to check in with your body, your boundaries, your emotional state, the more they call you disciplined. You've learned to wear disconnection like armor. You call it focus, but it's often just the absence of feeling. And here's the irony. The more disconnected you become, the more praise you receive. So you start chasing that state, disregarding your inner voice, ignoring rest, resisting reflection, not because it's healthy, but because it produces results. And in a world that values output over wholeness, results are worshipped. You think your productivity is proof that you're managing life well, but it might be proof that you've numbed enough to function. The machine runs smoother when you forget you're human. Real connection with yourself slows you down. It tells you to rest, to reflect, to feel. But when you start doing that, you produce less. And producing less feels like failure. So you override it again. And you wonder why burnout doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like you're still functioning, but you can't feel anything. Maybe the problem isn't that you're unproductive when emotional. Maybe the problem is that productivity only shows up when you disappear. What if you're not growing, just surviving in more acceptable ways? You look at your past and feel proud. You've changed. You've matured. You've made better choices. You've distanced yourself from the chaos. You've become more regulated. You think that's growth. But what if it's just adaptation? Not all evolution is conscious. Sometimes we don't become better. We just become more tolerable. You stopped yelling, but you started freezing. You stopped begging, but you started withdrawing. You stopped exploding, but now you implode. And because it looks quieter, the world calls it progress. But progress isn't always visible from the outside. And silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means suppression. Sometimes it means you've internalized what you used to fight against. Sometimes it means you've simply swapped one survival strategy for another that gets less pushback. You used to ask for love loudly. Now you just hope someone notices the silence. You used to demand to be heard. Now you shrink before you're even spoken to. You used to panic. Now you numb. and everyone around you thinks you're doing better. But you're not. You're just harder to read. Growth isn't about being more palatable. It's about being more whole. And being whole sometimes looks messy. Sometimes it means unlearning the silence that gets you praised. Sometimes it means becoming more disruptive, not less. If your growth has made you easier for others but harder for yourself, then it's not growth. It's performance. It's coping dressed as transformation. And you don't owe the world a cleaner version of your pain. You owe yourself the truth of what it cost you to survive. What if the life you're creating is designed to please someone who's no longer watching? You tell yourself you're building this life for you. The achievements, the posture, the pace, it's all part of becoming who you're meant to be. But if you slow down and really look at what you're doing, a deeper question emerges. Who are you trying to impress? Sometimes it's not about what you want. It's about what someone once told you should want. Maybe it was a parent who always looked disappointed. Maybe it was a teacher who made you feel small. Maybe it was a version of yourself that only felt loved when you were perfect. You think you've moved on, but your life is still a performance for an audience that might not even exist anymore. You work late because you were once told you were lazy. You overexplain because you were once told you were difficult. You overachieve because you were once told you were ordinary. And now, every choice you make is shaped by the need to rewrite that script. Not for the world, but for someone who left that line in your head years ago. Even your joy is suspect. Sometimes you celebrate not because you're proud, but because you imagine the approval you'd finally get if they could see you now. You think that's closure, but it's not. It's captivity. You build a life trying to prove something, but the person you're trying to prove it to may never come back. And worse, even if they did, they probably wouldn't notice, or care, or remember what they said. That's the tragedy. You've become fluent in someone else's expectations. And now, you mistake them for your own. So ask yourself, are you living for freedom? Or are you just trying to win an argument that ended long ago? What if you're not tired, just living in constant resistance to your truth? You say you're tired. You talk about burnout, about fatigue, about needing a break. You think it's the workload, the pressure, the noise. But what if your exhaustion isn't from what you're doing? What if it's from what you're not saying? Most of your energy isn't spent on tasks. It's spent on suppression, on holding things in, on hiding what you feel, on pretending you're fine when you're not, on smiling when you're aching, on nodding when you want to scream. That takes energy, more than you realize. You've trained yourself to be manageable, palatable, predictable. You minimize your needs so others don't feel uncomfortable. You tone yourself down so you don't come across as dramatic. You keep the peace, externally, by starting a war inside yourself. And now you're tired. Not because you're weak, because you're carrying the weight of all the things you're not allowed to feel. There's a cost to pretending, to withholding, to wearing a mask so often that it starts to feel like your face. The cost isn't just emotional. It's physical. It shows up in your shoulders, in your chest, in your sleep, in your silence. You wake up feeling like you've already run a marathon, because you have internally. And even when you rest, you don't recharge, because resting doesn't help if you're still hiding. Rest doesn't heal what avoidance created. This kind of tired doesn't come from effort. It comes from resistance. You're fighting a truth you haven't said out loud, a part of you you've buried, a need you've denied, a boundary you've ignored. And that fight is invisible, but relentless. You don't need more sleep. You need to stop lying to yourself about what you actually feel. What if you're not growing apart? You were just never aligned without the illusions. You say the relationship is changing, that you're growing apart, that something subtle, unspoken, heavy is building between you. You look back on the early days and wonder where the closeness went. But maybe it was never real to begin with. Maybe what you had wasn't connection. Maybe it was projection. Early on, you see what you want to see. You highlight compatibility. You downplay difference. You edit your personality to match what works. You fall in love with a version of them that fits your story, and a version of yourself you wish were permanent. And for a while, the illusion holds. But over time, your real needs rise. Their real limits surface. And the image begins to crack. Not because you're breaking it, but because it was never whole. You begin to realize that the closeness you felt was built on mutual blind spots. Shared hope, not shared understanding. And now you're waking up. You're not growing apart. You're just finally seeing clearly, without the intoxication of fantasy. You're noticing the parts of them that never matched you. You're seeing the parts of yourself you silenced to keep it smooth. You call this drift. But maybe it's just gravity reasserting itself. This is the hidden truth behind many breakups. Not that something broke, but that the performance ended. That the pretending ran out. That the mask got heavy. That your nervous system stopped playing nice. Real connection isn't compatibility under pressure. It's honesty under pressure. And most people don't survive that test. Because the moment the illusion fades, so does the feeling of safety. And the love you thought you built. Maybe it was just two people trying not to be alone at the same time. What if you don't actually want to be free? You say you want freedom, emotional freedom, creative freedom, the freedom to choose, to move, to be yourself. But when you're finally given the chance, you don't run. You hesitate. You self-sabotage. You crawl back to structure, to certainty, to whatever was holding you in place before. Why? Because freedom isn't comfort. It's exposure. And most people don't want that. You think freedom will feel like expansion, but it often feels like abandonment, like standing on a blank canvas with no instructions, no path, no one to blame. And that terrifies you, because now you have to face yourself, without the alibi of circumstance. You have to admit that you don't know what you want, only what you were trained to want. Structure gives you identity. Freedom takes it away. You start realizing that the rules you resented were the same ones keeping your fear from showing. You find yourself recreating limits, inventing urgency, overcommitting, not because you're busy, but because you're scared of what happens when you finally stop performing. Even in relationships, you say you want emotional independence, but when someone gives you space, you call it distance. You ask for trust, but panic when you're not reassured. You want choice, but only when the consequences are soft. You confuse freedom with control, your control. But freedom doesn't come with control. It comes with silence, with blankness, with the absence of excuses. You don't get to blame your parents, or society, or the schedule. You don't get to say, I couldn't. You just stand there, free, and realize you don't know who you are without something to push against. And that's when most people run. Not because they hate freedom, but because deep down, they never actually wanted it. What if you're not struggling because you're failing, but because you're succeeding at living a life that doesn't fit you? You wake up exhausted. You push through your day. You meet deadlines, attend meetings, manage emotions, survive interactions, and at night, you collapse. You call it burnout. You think you're behind, that you need to try harder, be more disciplined. But what if the problem isn't that you're failing? What if you're just in the wrong life? You're succeeding at following rules you didn't write. You're doing well in a role you don't believe in. You're meeting expectations that drain you. You're checking boxes that were handed to you before you knew how to question them. And you call that success. But inside, it doesn't feel like success. It feels like suffocation. You were told what a good life looks like. Stability, productivity, niceness, achievement. You followed the blueprint. You performed. You adapted. You fit in. And now everything looks okay on the outside, but it feels wrong, misaligned, dull, sometimes even hostile. And the worst part is, you keep blaming yourself. You think your anxiety means you're weak. You think your procrastination means you're lazy. You think your resentment is a moral flaw. But maybe those aren't dysfunctions. Maybe they're signals. Your system screaming that you're out of sync. You don't need a better routine. You need a different rhythm. But no one teaches you how to notice that. So you optimize. You read more, meditate more, adjust more, all in service of surviving a life that was never designed for your nervous system in the first place. You're not broken. You're just well-trained. And the cost of that training is now showing up as fatigue. Not because you're failing to keep up, but because your body is begging you to stop. What if you're not avoiding failure? You're avoiding the responsibility that comes with potential. You say you're afraid of failing, that you procrastinate because you're scared it won't work, that you self-sabotage because you doubt your talent. You tell yourself you're fragile, cautious, overwhelmed. But what if failure isn't what you're running from? What if it's success? You've tasted your own potential before. You've glimpsed how powerful, creative, focused, magnetic you can be when you let yourself fully try. You've felt the momentum, the surge, the clarity, and then you pulled back, disappeared, undermined it, ghosted your own ambition. Because deep down, you know that once you show what you're capable of, you'll be held to it. People will expect more. You'll expect more. You won't be able to hide behind, "I didn't really try" anymore. You'll have to own your ability, carry it, sustain it, defend it. And that kind of pressure doesn't come with applause. It comes with exposure. Potential sounds glamorous when it's abstract, but when it's realized, it becomes responsibility. You can't unsee it. You can't pretend you're average. You can't blame the system. You can't fade into the background. You become visible, and visibility makes you accountable. So instead, you stay just close enough to excellence that people suspect you're capable, but not close enough to prove it. You hover in the middle. You keep trying to try. You stay stuck in cycles of preparation, because preparation never has to deliver. Failure is safe. It ends the story. Success keeps the story going and demands more from you every time. And maybe that's what you're really afraid of. Not falling short, but standing up and realizing that now, there's no place to hide. You hide. You didn't forgive them. You just needed the conflict to end. You tell yourself it's over, that you forgave them, that you moved on. You rehearse the story so it sounds like resolution. They hurt you. You processed it, and you released it. But the truth isn't in the story. It's in your body. If you flinch when their name comes up, if your tone changes when they're mentioned, if your jaw tightens even slightly when you remember the conversation, you didn't forgive. You just decided to stop fighting. And that's not the same. You didn't let go. You shut down. Forgiveness isn't peace. It's process. It requires grief, not just logic. And most people never get that far. They don't forgive to heal. They forgive to escape. They want the tension gone. They want their mind back. They want their image intact. So they tell themselves the pain is over. Not because it is, but because holding on to it would disrupt too much else. They don't want to be the angry one, the dramatic one, the one who can't move on. So they perform closure. And that performance becomes their prison. The real problem is this. If you skip the emotional truth, you don't move forward. You just go quiet. You keep the resentment in your peripheral vision. You keep rehearsing the apology they never gave. You keep punishing them silently through indifference, withdrawal, or cold civility. And the worst part, you can't talk about it anymore. Because now, you're the one who said it's fine. So it stays stuck. What you call forgiveness is often a strategy, a defense, an internal compromise to protect your identity as someone who's strong enough to rise above it. But real forgiveness isn't about being strong. It's about being honest about how deeply something broke you and still deciding not to carry that break forward. You can't do that if you pretend it never happened. You don't actually want closure. You want permission to hold on. Closure is a myth we tell ourselves to keep grief contained. You imagine it as a clean ending, a final conversation, a moment where everything will make sense. But closure isn't about understanding. It's about justification. And that makes it dangerous. You don't want closure so you can move on. You want closure so you can make staying stuck feel reasonable. You're not looking for healing. You're looking for a reason to stay loyal to your pain without having to call it obsession. That's why you keep checking their page. Why you replay the same memories. Why you revisit conversations that already happened 100 times. Because you're not trying to end it. You're trying to relive it enough that it eventually feels less sharp. But repetition isn't relief. It's reinforcement. The more you revisit it, the more it embeds. You become fluent in the language of that relationship, that betrayal, that loss, and every time you speak it, you reinforce the identity that was shaped inside it. Closure becomes a ritual, a task that's never done. And as long as it's not done, you get to stay in limbo, not responsible for moving forward, not required to feel joy. You build your life around the unfinished business of what never healed. But that business may never finish. Some people never explain why they left. Some endings never give you symmetry. Some betrayals never make sense. And waiting for them to do so just gives them more space in your life than they deserve. Real closure is ugly. It looks like deciding the apology isn't coming, that the final word won't be said, that the version of peace you wanted will never arrive. And still, you choose to put the story down. Not because it feels resolved, but because it no longer deserves to keep writing itself through you. You think you're self-aware, but all you've really mastered is self-editing. You talk about growth. You reflect. You analyze. You've read the books. You journal. You catch yourself in patterns. You apologize. You know how to describe your flaws, your trauma, your fears. You sound self-aware. But what you've really mastered isn't honesty. It's self-editing. You've learned how to talk about yourself in ways that make discomfort feel admirable. You've learned how to package pain in language that makes it palatable. You know how to present your struggles in ways that earn respect. But what happens in the silence, when no one's listening, when no one's asking, when no one's watching? Self-awareness isn't performance. It's confrontation. It's not your ability to articulate your wounds. It's your ability to sit with them, without intellectualizing, without reframing, without turning the mirror away the moment it shows you something ugly. You say, I struggle with control, but you don't ask why you still expect others to shape themselves around your anxiety. You say, I'm afraid of vulnerability, but you don't notice how you sabotage closeness before it can even form. You say, I have abandonment issues, but you keep chasing people who prove your fear right and call it fate. Insight isn't healing. Recognition isn't transformation. Awareness without accountability is just decoration. It makes you sound evolved while leaving your behaviors untouched. Because real self-awareness doesn't flatter you. It humiliates you. It forces you to admit that some of your suffering is self-created, that your comfort zone is built from excuses, that your coping mechanisms have become weapons you use on people who try to love you. Most people don't avoid self-awareness. They just stop at the part that makes them look good. You're not protecting yourself. You're just practicing abandonment before anyone else can. You say you're careful. You set boundaries. You watch for red flags. You don't rush into closeness anymore. You take your time. Stay grounded. Keep perspective. And from the outside, it looks like wisdom. But from the inside, it feels like silence. You've mastered the art of leaving before being left. You call it self-respect. You say you're not putting up with the same patterns. But what you're really doing is rehearsing loss in slow motion, pulling away not because someone hurt you, but because they might. You've mistaken self-abandonment for self-protection. You stop answering before they stop asking. You minimize what you need so no one has the chance to fail you. You go quiet first so you're not startled by their silence. You choose distance so that when they choose it, it doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like confirmation. And the worst part, you call this power. You don't realize that every time you do it, you're reinforcing the story you claim to be healing from. That you'll always be too much, too needy, too emotional. That love is something you have to manage, not receive. You're not being cautious. You're being preemptively invisible. So no one has to choose you and risk not choosing you back. But that doesn't protect your heart. It just ensures that you'll never know what it could have felt like to let someone meet it fully. And maybe the pain isn't that others don't see you. Maybe it's that you're no longer giving them anything real to see. You didn't lose your spark. You just forgot what it feels like when something's real. You say something's missing, that you don't feel lit up anymore. You've lost momentum, lost creativity, lost your sense of drive. You used to be inspired. Now everything feels flat, gray, mechanical. So you blame the schedule, the pressure, the world. But what if the problem isn't that you've changed? What if the problem is that you've stopped letting anything touch you deeply enough to matter? When something is real, truly real, it interrupts you. It derails plans. It challenges your beliefs. It demands your presence. But somewhere along the way, you got efficient. You got polished. You got responsible. And you started optimizing your life to avoid any experience that could destabilize you. You dulled your edges. You started avoiding the art that made you cry, the people who made you feel too much, the questions you couldn't answer, the risks that forced you to let go of the version of yourself you could manage. And now, you're wondering why you feel dead inside. But it's not depression. It's distance. You don't let anything break your rhythm anymore. And in doing that, you've insulated yourself from the only things that ever made you feel truly alive. The spark didn't vanish. It just can't breathe in the airtight life you've built around not feeling too much. You're not being present. You're just distracted enough to avoid confronting yourself. You keep hearing the advice, be present. So you try. You meditate. You breathe. You slow down. You walk through the day with a little more mindfulness. You sip your coffee and pay attention to how it tastes. But presence is not just sensory awareness. Real presence brings up whatever you've been suppressing. And most people aren't ready for that. You think being present will feel peaceful. But what it often brings is grief, anger, longing, unanswered questions. The noise you've buried under the distractions you now call routine. So instead, you stay just busy enough. You fill the space with manageable tasks, productive errands, purposeful scrolling. You tell yourself you're grounded. But really, you're orbiting around the truth that you don't know who you are without the next task. That stillness feels dangerous, that your own thoughts, when uninterrupted, become too sharp to sit beside. Presence isn't peace, it's contact with whatever you've been using momentum to avoid. And that's why you don't reach for it often. Not because you're bad at being present, but because the moment you are, you remember the parts of yourself that are still waiting to be heard. You'll stay distracted as long as distraction feels safer than recognition. But deep down, you know, what you're afraid of isn't the silence. It's what the silence might say back. You're not who you think you are. You're just the version that was safest to become. You think your personality is the real you, the version you've refined over time, the one with preferences, boundaries, and beliefs that feel solid. You call it self-awareness. You describe yourself with confidence. You say, "This is just who I am." But that's not what happened. You became who you needed to be in order to avoid pain. Your personality is not a reflection of your true self. It's the structure you built to survive. You learned early which emotions were allowed and which ones weren't. You figured out what made people withdraw and what made them stay. You discovered that being quiet got you hurt less, or that being loud got you noticed, or that pleasing people gave you access to safety. You didn't choose these responses. They were adaptations. Now you call them traits. You don't say, "I adapted to unpredictability by becoming hyper-independent." You say, "I'm just really self-sufficient." You don't say, "I learned to suppress emotion to avoid rejection." You say, "I'm just not that sensitive." But the origin is the same, protection. The problem isn't that you did this. The problem is that you forgot you were doing it. You internalized the pattern and began to defend it. You shaped your life around preserving the structure. You made decisions from within it, loved from within it, tried to heal from within it. But what you call self is often just the safest available version. That version might be highly functional. It might win praise. It might get things done. But it might also be hollow. It might also keep you from taking risks, from asking for what you actually need, from letting people see what's behind the mask. You never became yourself. You became what kept you safe. And now you have to decide whether safety is worth staying hidden for the rest of your life. You don't want understanding. You want the illusion that you're not alone in your confusion. You say you want to be understood. You say that if someone could just get it, really get it, you'd feel less heavy. You talk about clarity like it's salvation. But that's not what you're really asking for. You don't want understanding. You want to know that the confusion you live in is shared, because understanding would require too much honesty. It would expose what you've spent years learning how to obscure. It would show the contradictions, the inconsistency, the way your actions and values never fully align. You'd have to let someone look at the mess without editing it. You'd have to stop performing. You're not ready for that. So you settle for resemblance. Someone who's confused in a similar way. Someone who mirrors your dysfunction enough that it feels like companionship. You call that connection. But it's proximity, not intimacy. You hide inside metaphors. You tell half-truths that sound deep enough to avoid questions. You use emotional language to describe things you've never examined. And when someone nods, you feel relief. Not because they see you, but because they didn't challenge what they saw. That's not understanding. That's mutual avoidance. You say you want to be known, but every time someone gets close to seeing you clearly, you change the subject. You dilute the feeling. You reroute the conversation. Because being understood isn't just about someone seeing you. It's about them reflecting you back without distortion. And you're afraid of what they'd reflect. So you live inside confusion and call it mystery. You keep people near enough to touch your outline, but never close enough to see what shape you actually take. Because if they really understood, you might have to as well. You're not afraid of the future. You're afraid that nothing you're doing right now will matter when it arrives. You talk about uncertainty, about fear of the unknown. You say the future makes you anxious, that you worry about outcomes, about how things will unfold. But fear of the future isn't really about time. It's about meaning. You're not afraid of what's coming. You're afraid that when it comes, it will show you that all of this was for nothing, that the hours you spent trying, the emotional weight you carried, the choices you made to be good, or safe, or wise, none of it will change the outcome. That no amount of effort guarantees anything. That's what haunts you. You don't want control. You want assurance. You want to believe that doing the right thing still leads to something. But the truth is, life doesn't reward consistency. It rewards conditions. Right place, right time, or wrong place, wrong time. And deep down, you know that. So you obsess over decisions, not because they're hard, but because you want to believe they matter. You want to believe that choosing well now protects you later, that being careful now prevents collapse later. But the future isn't waiting to validate your effort. It might ignore it completely. And that's what you're really afraid of, that what you're building is fragile, that what you're investing in can be undone in a moment, that none of it guarantees peace, or stability, or meaning. You're not scared of what might happen. You're scared that when it does, you'll look back and realize you were never safe to begin with. You haven't outgrown the past. You've just built a personality that works better with it unacknowledged. You tell yourself you've healed, that you've moved on, that the things that hurt you don't define you anymore. You have distance now, awareness, better language. You've built a stable identity, and you hold it up as proof of progress. But identity can be a shield. What you've really done is construct a version of yourself that can function with the damage intact. Not resolved, just accommodated. You avoid the same situations. You respond faster to certain dynamics. You cut people off earlier. You enforce rules that keep you safe. But that's not the absence of pain. That's preemptive management. That's redesigning your life to never get too close to the original wound again. You say you're more mature. But it's not maturity, it's learned defensiveness. You don't actually engage the memory. You just route your behavior around it. You've built emotional architecture around something that's still leaking. and because it no longer spills out in obvious ways. You call it growth. But emotional growth doesn't just mean you function better. It means the wound stops running your life silently. It means you stop organizing your choices around it. And most people never get there, because the coping structure they build looks enough like strength that they stop questioning it. You didn't heal. You adapted well enough that the original injury can stay hidden, just beneath the surface of who you've become. You don't fear losing control. You fear being seen without it. You say you like order, that you need routine. That unpredictability overwhelms you. You say you get anxious when things spiral or feel unclear. But this isn't about external chaos. It's about visibility. What terrifies you isn't the loss of control. It's the exposure that comes with it. When you're not composed, your real patterns emerge. Your doubts, your rage, your fear, your need. The parts of you that don't fit the image you've spent years perfecting. And that image has become more important than the truth. So you keep everything tightly held. You micromanage your reactions. You rehearse your vulnerability. You don't let anything get too messy. Because mess doesn't just disrupt the day, it disrupts your story. You've built credibility around being the one who's got it together. And you don't know who you are if that version collapses. So you avoid situations that test your emotional edge. You play it safe in relationships. You lead with logic. You turn pain into productivity. You say it's about resilience. But it's not. It's about hiding. Because when you lose control, people see the part of you that's still unfinished, still afraid, still trying to prove something. And even though everyone has that part, you've convinced yourself yours must remain private. You don't fear being unregulated. You fear being witnessed in your raw, unprocessed state and not being forgiven for it. You're not chasing a better life. You're just trying to escape the emptiness you won't admit is already here. You talk about goals, visions, improvements. You say you want a better job, a better body, a better relationship, a better version of yourself. You keep moving forward. You call it ambition. But a lot of ambition is just redirection. You're not building a future. You're running from the present. You stay busy because silence makes the emptiness louder. You chase growth because satisfaction feels dangerous. You fix what isn't broken because sitting still would force you to feel what's underneath everything else. The emptiness isn't a gap in your life. It's a structure. It's the foundation most of your efforts were built on. It's what drives you to achieve, but never feel full. To connect, but never feel safe. To rest, but never feel rested. And instead of naming that emptiness, you call it momentum. But momentum without direction is just avoidance in motion. You accumulate routines, accomplishments, distractions, none of which touch the real issue, which is that no amount of improvement will make you feel whole if the core feeling underneath all of it is, I don't know who I am without striving. So you keep striving, and it works on the surface. You get things done. You impress people. You stay ahead. But the moment you stop, even briefly, the question returns, what is this actually for? And if you don't have a clear answer, you keep running, not towards something, just away from the feeling you're not allowed to name. You don't struggle with intimacy. You struggle with being known in a way you can't control. You say closeness is hard, that intimacy takes time, that you're cautious because you've been hurt. But underneath the language of emotional safety is something much simpler and harder to admit. You're not afraid of love. You're afraid of being interpreted. When someone sees you up close, they form opinions about parts of you that you can't edit. Your voice when you're defensive. The way your face falls when you feel dismissed. The moments when your need leaks through the image you've spent years polishing. And you can't control how they see it, or what meaning they attach to it. That's what feels unsafe. You don't want to be misunderstood, but you also don't want to explain. You want someone to see you without being confused, but you don't want to hand them the script. You want to be read correctly without having to translate every signal. And when that doesn't happen, when they interpret you in a way that doesn't match the identity you're trying to protect, you pull back. Not because you don't care, but because you don't want to feel reduced. Or worse, wrong about yourself. So you manage closeness by managing the image. You stay in control by staying just out of range. And you call that emotional intelligence. But it's not emotional intelligence. It's emotional strategy. You're not afraid of losing connection. You're afraid of keeping it and not being able to shape how it sees you. You didn't become more secure. You just became more skilled at pretending you don't need anything. You've convinced yourself you've grown, that you're more stable now, that you've stopped relying on others for reassurance, approval, or care. You say you've matured, that you've learned to self-soothe, that you've outgrown codependency. But what if you just learned how to repress your need better? You didn't stop needing affection, clarity, tenderness, or consistency. You just stopped asking for it. You stopped hoping it would come. Because the disappointment got heavy, the waiting got humiliating, the vulnerability got too sharp. So you rebranded your silence as strength. Now you say things like, "I'm just low maintenance," or "I've learned not to expect much from people," or "I'm good on my own." But what you really mean is, "I've accepted that no one is coming." You pride yourself on not being a burden. But what you've really done is abandon the parts of you that felt too inconvenient to keep protecting. And people reward you for it. They say you're chill, easy to be around, so emotionally independent. But what they're really praising is your absence. Your ability to suppress needs so effectively that it never disrupts theirs. And so you keep performing, because it feels safer than trying again. Because trying again might require admitting that the need never went away. It just got buried under the persona of someone who doesn't ask for anything anymore. But strength isn't the absence of need. It's the courage to bring that need into the light and not apologize for it. You don't feel numb because you're broken. You feel numb because feeling was never safe. You say you're tired, uninspired, flat. You miss joy, but can't access it. You miss connection, but feel distant from everyone. You keep saying something feels off, but you don't know what. You call it burnout. You call it a phase. But what you're feeling is numbness. And numbness isn't emptiness. It's protection. You didn't stop feeling because you don't care anymore. You stopped feeling because your nervous system decided that caring was too dangerous, too expensive, too exposed. You've learned that sadness slows you down. That anger pushes people away. That joy makes you vulnerable to disappointment. That grief makes you inconvenient. So over time, your system stopped letting those emotions through. Not because they weren't there, but because they became threats. So you adapted. You became neutral. You made everything manageable. You turned wild emotions into calm thoughts. You stopped letting feelings take up space. And you called that control. But control isn't peace. It's just a more socially acceptable kind of dissociation. You don't need to fight the numbness. You need to understand what it's protecting you from. Because buried underneath it is the emotional memory of what it cost you the last time you felt too much. And if you want to feel again, you don't need more stimulation. You need more safety. Not the kind that comes from avoiding your emotions, but the kind that comes from finally being allowed to have them. The simulation of recovery functions on the elimination of triggers, not the elimination of dependency. Recovery is frequently mistaken for the absence of reaction. This misidentification is structurally reinforced by environments that confuse reduced volatility with restored integrity. A system that no longer expresses observable instability is declared healed, regardless of whether the underlying dynamics have been altered or simply avoided. This distinction is not semantic. The organism's reactivity has not ceased. It has been recontextualized. Former stimuli no longer activate overt disruption, not because the internal structure has been reprocessed, but because the stimuli have been removed, diluted, or rendered inaccessible. The recovery is conditional. Avoidance can mimic resolution when control over the environment is maximized. Once the possibility of provocation is sufficiently minimized, the organism stabilizes, not through transformation, but through environmental censorship. What follows is a behavioral quieting that resembles emotional neutrality, but is in fact a recalibration of risk thresholds. Social systems reward this condition. The behavior appears regulated. The subject becomes more legible, more tolerable, and more predictable. These metrics are interpreted as healing. In fact, they are indicators of suppression. The internal contradiction remains. It is simply no longer exposed to friction. Adaptation becomes indistinguishable from integrity once the variables are sufficiently sterilized. The illusion of recovery persists so long as environmental control is preserved. Once disruption is reintroduced, the reactivity returns, not as a regression, but as a continuation of the same unprocessed circuitry. The simulation is maintained by withdrawing from conditions that previously revealed the instability. This is classified as maturity, despite the fact that nothing fundamental has changed. What has changed is the external architecture, fewer demands, reduced exposure, increased self-monitoring. A healed system is one that can be reintroduced to its original destabilizing conditions without reproducing the collapse. If the system still requires distance to maintain equilibrium, then equilibrium is not inherent, it is externally enforced. Such a system is not well. It is isolated. The appearance of healing, therefore, becomes a performance of behavioral conformity in reduced conditions. It is not the result of integration, but of editing. It is not wholeness. It is silence. Clarity is avoided because its acceptance would destabilize structural commitments that cannot be rebuilt. The stated desire for clarity is often functionally invalid. What is labeled as confusion is rarely a lack of understanding. More often, it is a refusal to operationalize what is already evident. The data required to act exists, but its implications are inconvenient, and so clarity is misclassified as absence rather than resistance. The psychological system avoids clarity not because it lacks access to truth, but because acknowledging truth would necessitate the collapse of existing justifications. These justifications support structures, relationships, identities, investments that cannot be quickly reassembled. The cost of clarity is structural instability. Therefore, confusion is not the absence of knowledge. It is the presence of conflict between known information and desired continuity. The subject claims to seek clarity, but clarity is not compatible with the outcomes they wish to preserve. Ambiguity is extended not because it is real, but because it is functional. Truth, when it emerges, is not processed neutrally. It disrupts. It demands reorganization. Acknowledging the full implications of what is known would mean invalidating previous commitments. This includes time, emotional labor, and self-image. The sunk costs are psychologically embedded. Delay mechanisms arise. The subject asks for more time, requests additional information, describes themselves as emotionally unready. But these mechanisms do not aim at preparedness. They aim at prolonging the current structure until avoidance can be plausibly framed as discernment. This pattern continues indefinitely. Clarity is available, but reframed as distant. Insight is accessible, but reclassified as premature. The system protects itself from internal collapse by suppressing the trigger, truth, to appear rational. The subject substitutes ambiguity for patience. But patience is not the avoidance of action. It is preparation for it. In this system, no action occurs. The appearance of intellectual rigor masks the fact that belief and behavior remain misaligned. Truth has no utility if its function is constantly deferred. Clarity is not valuable when its acceptance is conditional. What is called confusion is often a mask for preservation. The system will continue to operate in contradiction until the cost of avoidance outweighs the cost of collapse. Rejection is intolerable only when it validates an internal model that preceded it. Rejection is commonly portrayed as a fear of interpersonal loss. This is inaccurate. The reaction to rejection is disproportionately strong not because of the event itself, but because the event serves as evidence for a pre-existing internal model of insufficiency. The rejection is not experienced as new information. It is processed as confirmation. The subject does not suffer because of external dismissal, but because the dismissal coincides with internal expectation. This expectation was not created by the event. It preceded it. The psychological impact of rejection is a function of how well it aligns with latent belief structures. If the subject carries a self-concept rooted in disposability, then any rejection, regardless of scale, activates the architecture of assumed inferiority. It is not the rejection that destabilizes. It is the convergence between reality and hypothesis. Avoidance of rejection is not a fear of pain. It is a fear of evidence. The subject constructs behavioral strategies to prevent data from entering the system that would validate their most corrosive assumptions. This includes limiting emotional investment, withholding expression, and retreating prior to exposure. These strategies are not designed to prevent rejection. They are designed to preserve uncertainty. As long as the hypothesis remains untested, doubt can be reframed as caution. But if the hypothesis is tested and confirmed, then the subject must integrate a negative self-assessment as objective. This possibility is not tolerable. Therefore, paralysis is rebranded as prudence. The subject avoids asking, avoids initiating, avoids performing. Risk is minimized not because of the outcome, but because of its interpretive weight. It is not the event that must be escaped. It is what the event appears to prove. In this structure, rejection is intolerable not due to its social implications, but due to its epistemological ones. The event provides support for a theory the subject has tried to keep theoretical. Once confirmed, the theory becomes part of the self-model, and that model, once internalized, dictates subsequent behavior. Thus, rejection is not feared for what it removes. It is feared for what it reveals. Identity is maintained not through consistency, but through repetitive avoidance of contradiction. The concept of a stable identity is functionally upheld not by the presence of continuity, but by the systematic exclusion of contradictory data. What appears to be a coherent self is the result of recursive filtration. The subject selects experiences that reinforce a chosen narrative, while minimizing or omitting those that destabilize it. Memory is not stored neutrally. It is edited to maintain logical and emotional symmetry with the self-concept. Conflicting memories are reframed or suppressed. Moments of failure are externalized. Moments of hypocrisy are minimized. This is not deception. It is structure-preserving distortion. When a behavior contradicts identity, the event is isolated, not integrated. It is labeled as temporary, situational, or uncharacteristic. This semantic strategy allows the identity to remain untouched. Even when the evidence for inconsistency is overwhelming, the behavior is treated as noise, not signal. This process is recursive. The more often it is performed, the more rigid the identity becomes. It evolves not through adaptation, but through entrenchment. The subject stops noticing dissonance, not because it no longer occurs, but because the system has adapted to discard it preconsciously. This explains why introspective breakthroughs are rare and often resisted. To integrate contradiction would require dismantling portions of the identity scaffold. This, in turn, would destabilize social relationships, self-justifications, and future planning. The cost of coherence loss is too high, so the contradiction is buried. Thus, identity is not maintained by truth. It is maintained by exclusion. What is left after years of filtration is not a person. It is a residue of what the subject could safely acknowledge. What is called authenticity is often just repetition that has gone unchallenged. Longing for closure is a mechanism for delaying responsibility after irreversible loss. Closure is often described as a psychological need following rupture. This need is assumed to be legitimate. In practice, it is frequently deployed as a justification for emotional inertia. The subject claims that until closure is achieved, they cannot move forward. This creates a conditional structure. Progress becomes dependent on an outcome no longer available. The closure narrative externalizes agency. The subject places their ability to resolve internal tension in the hands of the absent, the unresponsive, or the irretrievable. This arrangement absolves them of the responsibility to adapt. It also permits the maintenance of emotional continuity with the object or event that caused the rupture. What is called grief often conceals fixation. What is described as open-ended processing is frequently a rebranded refusal to reconfigure life without the original referent. Closure, in this case, is not a path to resolution. It is a delay tactic. The premise of closure assumes that explanations resolve pain. But explanation is not equivalent to transformation. Understanding why something ended does not reverse its impact. The loss remains. The disruption is historical. No answer retroactively alters the outcome. The information is inert. But the subject behaves as though the answer has catalytic power. This belief creates paralysis. Closure becomes a perpetual horizon, not because it cannot be reached, but because it cannot deliver what has been promised. It does not heal. It does not undo. It does not stabilize. It simply occupies attention long enough to prevent re-engagement with reality. Most closure attempts are emotional negotiations with finality. The subject resists the irreversibility of what has occurred. The desire is not to understand, but to imagine that understanding will make the loss optional. This is not truth-seeking. It is revisionism masked as inquiry. The structure persists until the emotional cost of waiting exceeds the perceived betrayal of letting go. Only then is movement reinitiated. Suppression of need is not strength. It is compliance with an environment that penalized expression. Psychological systems that present as independent often arise from histories where dependence was punished or ignored. The resulting behavioral structure appears resilient. The subject describes themselves as self-reliant. They highlight autonomy. They express disdain for neediness. This posture is interpreted as strength. It is not. The elimination of expressed need is not evidence of wholeness. It is evidence of adaptation to an unaccommodating environment. If expressing need reliably led to disappointment, punishment, or ridicule, then the system develops a new rule. Silence is safer than exposure. What follows is the internalization of denial. Need is not simply hidden from others. It is hidden from the self. The subject stops registering desire as actionable. They reframe absence as preference. They interpret emotional detachment as discipline. They identify numbness as clarity. This reinterpretation is rewarded. The social system finds the subject manageable. The subject finds themselves productive. The behavioral outputs are efficient. But efficiency is not wellness. It is the byproduct of suppressed variance. The organism no longer reacts to internal signals, not because it has transcended them, but because it no longer believes it is permitted to respond. Requests become threats. Vulnerability becomes evidence of failure. This schema is stable only under conditions of isolation or surface-level interaction. When intimacy or unpredictability re-enter the system, the suppressed architecture destabilizes. The system's core belief remains unchanged. Need leads to loss. To protect itself, the subject preemptively withholds. This is misread as regulation. It is avoidance. The absence of expressed need is not peace. It is compliance. The reward is that no one leaves. The cost is that no one arrives. Self-awareness does not prevent repetition. It provides the vocabulary to justify it. It is often assumed that increased self-awareness leads to behavioral change. This assumption is unsupported by observable patterns. In practice, awareness frequently precedes repetition, not transformation. The subject acquires language to describe internal patterns, but continues to reproduce them without modification. Recognition does not generate reversal. It produces articulation. The subject can now identify their cognitive distortions, attachment styles, trauma responses, or behavioral loops. This provides the illusion of progress. In reality, the dysfunction remains intact. This is not a paradox. It is a structural artifact. The function of self-awareness in this context is not disruption. It is defense. The subject uses awareness as insulation. By naming the behavior, they reduce its perceived volatility. It becomes normalized through repetition and description. The response becomes familiar, then justified. Behavior that was once impulsive is now reframed as thematic. It becomes part of the subject's identity. Instead of attempting to alter the behavior, the subject integrates it. They say, "This is part of my wiring," or "I know I do this." These phrases do not precede correction. They substitute for it. Awareness can enable adjustment, but it is not a guarantee. When awareness does not serve as a trigger for correction, it serves as a rationalization. The subject describes their awareness to others. This performance is socially rewarded. The appearance of introspection is misread as change. In fact, change often declines after awareness is achieved. The cognitive dissonance between action and insight is resolved not by altering the action, but by reinterpreting the insight. The subject begins to believe that recognition is sufficient. Over time, this system becomes recursive. The subject repeats the behavior, recognizes it, explains it, and returns to it. No disruption occurs. No reconfiguration is initiated. The cycle is protected by vocabulary. The dysfunction remains fully operational. Only now it has subtitles. Stability is often misidentified as psychological health when it is merely the absence of friction. The system that appears emotionally stable is frequently misinterpreted as internally secure. But a lack of observable disruption is not equivalent to resolution. It is more often an indicator of low-contact environments and tightly managed conditions. Stability is contextual, not intrinsic. Behavioral equilibrium is often achieved by minimizing exposure to variables that provoke internal conflict. This is not healing. It is avoidance implemented at scale. The internal system has not been altered. The external inputs have been sanitized. A subject may appear composed, reliable, and unaffected. These traits are praised. But the absence of volatility does not indicate the absence of unresolved structures. It indicates the presence of environmental control. When that control is removed through intimacy, disorder, or sustained unpredictability, the stability dissolves. This dissolution is often framed as regression. In fact, it is reversion. The original structure was never dismantled. It was merely unprovoked. Once stress reintroduces complexity, the prior patterns resume. What was described as maturity is revealed to be containment. Systemic overcorrection reinforces this illusion. The subject builds routines. They schedule avoidance. They reduce variability to preserve composure. From the outside, this is indistinguishable from resilience. From the inside, it is not peace, it is sustained calibration. Stability under these conditions becomes less about regulation and more about restriction. The subject does not expand their capacity to feel. They compress the range of what they encounter. The result is a consistent behavioral pattern that emerges not from wellness, but from narrow tolerances. True resilience is measured not by what the system avoids, but by what it can absorb and still remain structurally coherent. If the system must limit inputs to maintain coherence, then it is not stable. It is brittle. It has not evolved. It has been quarantined. Behavioral improvement is often a shift in strategy, not a shift in system. When behavior changes, it is often interpreted as evidence that the internal system has changed. This assumption is comforting, but unfounded. In most cases, behavioral change reflects a recalibrated strategy, not a restructured framework. The motive remains consistent. Only the method shifts. Consider a subject who stops expressing anger outwardly. This is praised as growth. But the impulse to control or punish has not vanished. It has simply been redirected, inward, silently, or passive-aggressively. The presentation has changed. The architecture has not. This pattern is pervasive. People who stop chasing validation may appear self-contained, but they are often seeking different forms of control, predictability, superiority, or emotional distance. What was once overt becomes covert. The emotional need persists. It is repackaged. System-level change is rare. It requires dismantling not just behavior, but the assumptions that generate behavior. These assumptions are not cosmetic. They are embedded in identity. Altering them requires disintegration, which most systems resist. As a result, change is simulated. The behavior adapts to avoid consequence. Not because the underlying belief has been disconfirmed. The belief persists. I am unworthy unless I achieve. I must avoid abandonment. I must control perception. These beliefs continue to govern choices, even when the visible behavior appears transformed. This explains why relapse occurs under pressure. The strategy fails. The system returns to its previous form. The conditions required to maintain the new behavior are removed. The old outputs reemerge. This is not a failure of discipline. It is the reappearance of an unchanged system. Genuine transformation is not achieved by substitution. It is achieved by invalidation of the logic beneath the behavior. Unless that logic is revised, change will always be surface level, contingent, and reversible. What most people call change is camouflage. Most confidence is the result of internal inconsistency that has gone unchallenged. What is commonly identified as confidence is often not the product of clarity, skill, or certainty. It is the outcome of a belief system that has never been properly interrogated. The individual expresses assurance not because they possess verified competence, but because their internal logic has not been exposed to contradiction. Confidence appears stable when the subject has constructed an environment in which their assumptions are never tested. Feedback loops are curated. Input is filtered. Dissonance is reinterpreted as irrelevance. In this configuration, the subject remains convinced of their correctness because no counter-evidence is allowed to persist. This structure is sustainable only within conditions of control. When environmental control weakens, confidence degrades rapidly. The subject experiences destabilization not due to external opposition, but due to internal incoherence being surfaced. The self-concept, once reinforced by unexamined assumptions, cannot support scrutiny. This form of confidence is not stability. It is insulation. It functions effectively until variables exceed its capacity for denial. Once contradiction is introduced and allowed to persist, the subject's confidence collapses, not gradually, but completely. The system was never balanced. It was simply untested. In contrast, true confidence is structurally indifferent to contradiction. It is not fragile because it is not reactive. It incorporates failure without identity degradation. But this form of confidence is rare because it is built on dismantled assumptions, not reinforced ones. Most confidence is maintained by exclusion, not integration. As long as internal contradiction is inaccessible, external behavior will continue to project certainty. This projection is misinterpreted by observers as authenticity, strength, or clarity. In truth, it is the performance of consistency within an unchecked framework. The system is not strong. It is merely unchallenged. Emotional maturity is often confused with the suppression of variables that cause emotional feedback. Emotional maturity is frequently misunderstood. It is assumed to be the absence of volatility, the capacity for rational restraint, and the appearance of control under pressure. These traits, when observed, are categorized as signs of development, but restraint is not the same as maturity. In most cases, it is preemptive suppression. What is being praised as maturity is the visible reduction in emotional expression. The subject does not erupt, collapse, or withdraw. But this restraint is often achieved not through internal coherence, but through minimization of complexity. The system has reduced its inputs, not expanded its tolerance. The reduction of feedback by avoiding intimacy, eliminating unpredictability, or reframing discomfort as irrelevance creates the illusion of maturity. There is no reaction because there is no provocation. The system functions smoothly only when conditions are artificially simplified. This is misread as progress. The subject becomes easier to engage. Their responses appear proportionate. But these metrics only hold in low-friction environments. Under pressure, the suppressed architecture reemerges. The system has not grown. It has contracted. True emotional maturity is measured not by what the system avoids, but by what it can absorb without fragmentation. If the system cannot tolerate contradiction, vulnerability, or prolonged ambiguity, then the absence of reactivity is not proof of growth. It is evidence of withdrawal. Over time, this suppression strategy calcifies. The subject stops seeking novelty, avoids depth, and prioritizes control. They experience fewer outbursts, but also fewer insights. Emotional range narrows. What remains is the performance of regulation in a controlled setting, not the integration of capacity in a chaotic one. This configuration is often reinforced by external validation. Others reward the subject's apparent stability. This creates an incentive to continue narrowing emotional exposure. The performance becomes identity. The subject internalizes the belief that peace means silence. But silence produced by restriction is not equilibrium. It is absence. Meaning is not discovered. It is constructed retroactively to prevent the collapse of effort. The pursuit of meaning is generally treated as a search, a process of locating significance that exists prior to observation. This framing assumes that meaning is embedded in life events and can be uncovered with sufficient reflection. But in most cases, meaning is assigned after the fact, as a defense against existential nullification. Effort, time, suffering, and attachment require justification. Without it, the subject risks confronting the possibility that their investment produced no intrinsic outcome. To prevent this realization, the subject constructs meaning retroactively. The narrative is adjusted to accommodate the effort already spent. This construction is not dishonest. It is structurally necessary. Systems that allow past expenditure to remain unexplained begin to deteriorate. Identity weakens. Emotional orientation loses direction. The subject experiences what is labeled as nihilism, but is more accurately the confrontation with structural incoherence. To resolve this, the subject reframes events. Pain is reinterpreted as growth. Failure is rebranded as redirection. Loss becomes character development. These narratives do not arise from evidence. They arise from need. The system cannot absorb the cost of emptiness, so it reclassifies the experience to preserve internal continuity. This form of meaning is not discovered. It is engineered. The process is not revelatory, but adaptive. Once effort has occurred, meaning must follow. Otherwise, the implication is that the effort was misplaced, or worse, irrelevant. The subject will deny this dependency. They will insist that meaning led to effort, not the reverse. But analysis of sequence reveals that interpretation often follows outcome. The narrative trails the result. If the outcome had been different, the meaning would also have shifted. This reveals that meaning is less about truth and more about preservation. It is a tool for stabilizing memory, not a description of external reality. The more costly the experience, the more meaning is demanded, and the more arbitrary the outcome, the more elaborate the justification becomes. The meaning is not a property of the event. It is the residue of a system that refuses to admit it might have been in motion for no reason. Most behavioral consistency is not integrity. It is the repetition of a strategy that once prevented punishment. Consistency in behavior is often misinterpreted as integrity. The subject is praised for stability, predictability, and apparent alignment between belief and action. However, in many cases, consistency is not the result of principled conviction. It is the repetition of a strategy that historically produced safety, reward, or invisibility. Early behavioral reinforcement plays a central role. Actions that prevented rejection, ridicule, or loss are stored as functional. The subject then repeats them regardless of context. Over time, these behaviors are not questioned. They are performed without assessment. This repetition is then framed as reliability. The system fails to distinguish between integrity and inertia. A consistent action does not require consistency of belief. It requires a singular emotional memory paired with a learned outcome. The behavior becomes autonomous. The subject mistakes it for character. When questioned, the subject may offer justification, but this is post hoc. The behavior was not maintained because it was logically evaluated. It was maintained because it was reinforced. The explanation exists to preserve coherence, not to reveal origin. This creates a closed system. The subject behaves in ways that once prevented pain, and retrofits those behaviors with ethical language. The ethical justification is unnecessary to the performance, but useful to the narrative. It allows the subject to interpret compulsion as virtue. This becomes self-reinforcing. Social validation increases for consistent behavior. The subject becomes invested in the identity that consistency produces. Changing the behavior would threaten that identity. So the strategy continues, even when it no longer serves a functional purpose. What began as adaptation becomes ideology. Integrity requires that belief precede action. Most consistency, however, is behavior that precedes belief. The justification is retroactive. The system protects itself not through values, but through avoidance of cognitive dissonance. Self-control is not a triumph of will. It is a reconfiguration of internal conflict toward acceptable outputs. Self-control is traditionally framed as mastery over impulse. The subject resists temptation, moderates emotion, or delays gratification. These behaviors are interpreted as evidence of superior willpower or moral development. But most instances of self-control are not victories of principle. They are tactical substitutions. The impulse is not eliminated. It is rerouted. The system learns to replace unaccepted expressions with permissible ones. The subject still seeks stimulation, dominance, reassurance, or relief, only now through pathways deemed socially acceptable. This creates the illusion of control. The system appears calm, disciplined, and rational, but beneath the surface, the same impulses persist. They are simply negotiated through new strategies. The subject does not develop neutrality. They develop plausible proxies. Aggression becomes passive defiance. Compulsion becomes productivity. Obsession becomes discipline. These behaviors are not fundamentally different from the originals. They are versions that escape penalty. This does not mean the system has matured. It has adapted. The desire remains structurally unchanged. Only its form has shifted. The underlying logic, I must control outcomes, avoid shame, assert worth, is preserved. This structure is reinforced by praise. The subject receives affirmation for their apparent restraint. The strategy is rewarded. Over time, the behavior becomes identity. The subject believes they are self-controlled because they no longer exhibit obvious excess. But excess has not been removed. It has been repackaged. The internal state is still governed by the same anxieties, compulsions, and insecurities. Control is not exercised over the origin of desire, only over its expression. This is not transformation. It is translation. True self-control would require invalidating the logic that produced the impulse. That rarely occurs. What occurs instead is concealment through efficiency. The impulse is converted, not resolved. Emotional clarity is rarely achieved because the system rewards language that obscures it. Most emotional language is designed to reduce discomfort, not to increase precision. The subject uses phrases like, I feel overwhelmed, I'm disconnected, or I have trust issues to refer to internal states. These phrases are socially recognized, low risk, and abstract enough to avoid confrontation with specific content. This ambiguity is not accidental. It is structurally reinforced. Language that obscures precision allows the subject to participate in emotional expression without disclosing actionable information. This enables engagement without vulnerability. The system does not reward clarity. It rewards compatibility. Specific emotions, rage, jealousy, disgust are high cost. They trigger conflict or moral judgment. Ambiguous language avoids these costs while preserving the appearance of self-awareness. Over time, the subject forgets what clarity requires. They no longer attempt to name exact thoughts, trace exact triggers, or identify specific unmet needs. They rely on generalized affective labels, which are repeated until they become identity markers. Emotional patterns are described, not understood. This results in communicative stasis. The subject reports their state, but no internal recalibration occurs. I feel anxious becomes a terminus, not a beginning. The expression discharges tension without producing insight. The system remains unchanged. Even introspection becomes vague. The subject journals, reflects, or meditates, but always through the lens of acceptable abstraction. Emotional complexity is flattened into digestible categories. The vocabulary is expansive, but the resolution is low. This condition is not dysfunction. It is adaptation. High-resolution emotional awareness creates exposure. Exposure creates risk. To avoid this, the system builds a lexicon that simulates insight while preventing dissection. Clarity does not emerge from speaking often. It emerges from being willing to describe precisely. Most systems are not optimized for that task. They are optimized to remain interpretable without being transparent. Emotional intelligence is often the ability to predict reactions, not the capacity to understand emotions. The term emotional intelligence implies a capacity to interpret, manage, and respond to emotional stimuli with precision and insight. However, its practical usage often reflects a different process. What is labeled as emotional intelligence is frequently the ability to predict the emotional responses of others and to modulate one's behavior accordingly. This is not understanding. It is calibration. Prediction relies on pattern recognition. The subject observes prior cause-effect sequences and uses them to anticipate outcomes. This is a form of social mapping. It enables effective performance in relationships, negotiations, and group dynamics. But this mapping does not require insight into the nature or content of emotional states. It requires only the correct anticipation of expression. This distinction is critical. The subject may be able to manage others' emotional reactivity without comprehending the underlying emotion itself. Anger, fear, guilt, or shame are treated as observable signals, inputs to a system, not as meaningful internal experiences. The response is strategic, not empathic. The subject becomes skilled at avoidance, redirection, de-escalation, or appeasement. These are viewed as evidence of maturity. In reality, they are evidence of refined manipulation, often benign, but not always grounded in emotional clarity. The behavior functions effectively, but does not require internal congruence. Internally, the subject may remain disconnected from their own emotional content. Their skill lies not in self-awareness, but in social engineering. This can result in a system that appears emotionally fluent, but is functionally detached. Emotional intelligence becomes indistinguishable from tactical compliance. This error is compounded when emotional intelligence is rewarded. The subject receives affirmation for avoiding conflict, managing perception, and navigating others' feelings. This incentivizes performance, not internal development. The behavior becomes self-reinforcing. Emotional intelligence, as commonly defined, rewards surface regulation. Depth is unnecessary. Insight is optional. as long as the subject can produce desirable emotional effects. The mechanism by which they achieve it is rarely questioned. What appears as maturity may be no more than a system that has mastered the social consequences of emotional behavior without altering the emotional system itself. Validation does not resolve internal doubt. It suspends it temporarily by outsourcing evaluation. Validation is typically pursued as a mechanism to reduce uncertainty. The subject presents an emotion, action, or perspective and receives affirmation from an external source. This affirmation is interpreted as proof of coherence. The subject feels stabilized, but the stabilization is temporary because the underlying doubt is not removed. It is outsourced. The system achieves temporary relief by placing the burden of assessment on another. This provides short-term security. If the external validator agrees, the internal tension recedes. However, the belief system that produced the need for validation remains unchanged. Over time, this produces dependency. The subject increasingly relies on external confirmation to maintain equilibrium. Any deviation, neutral feedback, disagreement, or lack of response reintroduces doubt, often amplified. The original doubt is now compounded by the absence of reassurance. This pattern is self-reinforcing. The more frequently validation is used as a regulatory mechanism, the more internal evaluation is suppressed. The subject no longer tests the validity of their own perception. They await confirmation. This delays the development of autonomous assessment. In this framework, validation does not answer the question, "Am I right?" It answers, "Will someone protect me from the consequences of uncertainty?" The emotional relief is not tied to accuracy. It is tied to acceptance. This creates a structural vulnerability. The subject becomes hypersensitive to dissent. Even minor contradiction is experienced as destabilizing. This is not due to the strength of the contradiction, but due to the absence of the familiar stabilizer. The subject has no internal counterweight. Long-term reliance on validation erodes resilience. The subject does not develop tolerance for ambiguity. They develop avoidance of it. This undermines self-trust. Evaluation becomes externalized entirely. The system is not guided by belief. It is guided by consensus. Eventually, validation ceases to regulate. The subject increases frequency or intensity of validation-seeking behavior. The returns diminish. The emotional infrastructure collapses, not because it was invalidated, but because it was never internally constructed to begin with. Apologies are often issued to restore control, not to acknowledge harm. The social function of apology is generally understood as the recognition of harm and the expression of regret. But in practice, many apologies are issued not to repair the injured party's experience, but to reestablish the speaker's narrative position. The apology functions as a tool of self-restoration. When an individual issues an apology, they are often not attempting to fully engage with the consequences of their actions. Instead, they are attempting to limit reputational damage, reassert moral alignment, or de-escalate conflict. The apology becomes a signal that is designed to stabilize their social role. This is especially true in contexts where the apology is unsolicited. The subject acts preemptively, not because they have achieved clarity or contrition, but because they anticipate negative consequences. The language of remorse is deployed strategically. It is not an endpoint. It is a reentry attempt. This does not imply insincerity. It implies structure. The apology, in this form, is a transaction. It offers linguistic deference in exchange for social equilibrium. It is judged successful not by the extent of internal change, but by the response it produces in the recipient. In some cases, the subject apologizes without fully understanding what was harmed. The apology becomes generic, abstract, or vague. The goal is not specificity. The goal is to activate forgiveness or closure without prolonged negotiation. This approach centers the speaker, not the event. Over time, Apologies issued in this pattern degrade in meaning. They are deployed reflexively. The subject becomes fluent in apology performance, but shows little behavioral deviation. The pattern continues. The apology is not evidence of change. It is evidence of self-management. Genuine apology requires the dismantling of the behavior's internal logic. In most cases, that logic is left intact. The apology serves as a patch, not a correction. It maintains the speaker's narrative that they are accountable, even if no structural accountability occurs. The listener receives the apology as resolution, but resolution is not present. The contradiction remains. The harm remains. The system is preserved. The words changed. Nothing else did. Most forgiveness occurs without accountability because the structure prioritizes emotional equilibrium over moral resolution. Forgiveness is often portrayed as a moral conclusion, a point of psychological maturity or relational evolution. In practice, forgiveness frequently occurs without the presence of accountability. The subject who is forgiven has not altered their behavior, acknowledged the full scope of harm, or restructured the underlying logic that led to the transgression. Yet forgiveness is granted. This is not a resolution. It is a concession to structural pressure. The psychological burden of carrying resentment, betrayal, or violation is high. If the harmed subject cannot induce behavioral change in the offender, they must choose between sustained emotional dysregulation or symbolic release. Forgiveness is selected not because justice has occurred, but because the internal system cannot afford to remain in conflict indefinitely. The process is reframed as empowerment. The harmed subject is told they are freeing themselves, but in reality, they are absorbing the cost of unresolved harm to restore functional continuity. The structure does not become just. It becomes quiet. This quiet is misinterpreted as healing. It is, in fact, containment. The individual remains harmed, but is now culturally and interpersonally discouraged from expressing it. Forgiveness becomes the event that ends the conversation, even if no reparation has taken place. The forgiven party often interprets this outcome as exoneration. They may experience relief, validation, or a re-established sense of moral alignment. However, the lack of accountability means that no transformation has occurred. The same logic that allowed the original harm to manifest remains intact. It is preserved. The system is unchanged. Forgiveness without accountability creates a precedent. Harm may be absorbed, but it is not corrected. The structure now teaches that transgression can be resolved without behavioral consequence. This destabilizes future trust. The performance of resolution replaces the substance of it. The term forgiveness implies completion. In most applications, it is premature. It resolves narrative tension at the expense of moral structure. Most personal boundaries are not expressions of self-knowledge. They are defensive architectures built around historical overexposure. Boundaries are presented as declarations of identity, markers of preference, value, or emotional clarity. In psychological discourse, boundaries are positioned as indicators of health, but many boundaries are not formed through self-understanding. They are constructed reactively, after repeated exposure to violation or unpredictability. The boundary does not express who the individual is. It expresses where the individual was repeatedly harmed. What is described as a limit is often a wall. The function is not to define healthy engagement, but to prevent recurrence. This creates boundaries that are absolute, inflexible, and context-independent. They serve to reduce exposure, not to define relational ethics. The individual may frame the boundary as clarity, but it is avoidance. It prevents the need to renegotiate trust, interpret nuance, or tolerate temporary ambiguity. In doing so, it removes the possibility of new outcomes. The boundary is not a filter. It is an exit strategy. This produces a defensive identity. The individual becomes a system of prohibitions rather than a set of principles. The self is defined not by what it seeks, but by what it rejects. This narrows the range of experience. It also decreases internal resilience. The system remains dependent on external management to feel safe. Over time, the individual may lose sight of the origin. The boundary becomes permanent. The event that required it is no longer relevant, but the structure remains. What was once a necessary constraint becomes a habitual reaction. The original injury is never reevaluated. It is simply displaced into policy. This is not strength. It is preservation through restriction. The system avoids re-injury by limiting participation, but it also limits access to growth, depth, and unpredictability, the very conditions through which identity is tested and refined. Moral identity is often a byproduct of behavioral inconsistency that has been framed as intention. Moral identity is typically defined as the internalization of ethical standards, an enduring commitment to principles that inform action. However, in many cases, moral identity is not based on behavior, but on the narrative attached to behavior. Inconsistency is not disqualifying. It is rationalized through intention. The subject performs actions that contradict their stated values. These contradictions are not integrated. They are explained away. The action is reframed as situational, the deviation as necessary. Over time, the gap between behavior and belief widens. Moral identity remains intact, not because it is accurate, but because it has been insulated from accountability. This insulation is made possible by selective memory, linguistic manipulation, and appeal to motive. The subject focuses not on outcomes, but on explanations. They say, "I meant well," "it was complicated," or "that's not who I am." These phrases are not clarifying. They are protective. The system rewards this. Intention is easier to affirm than pattern. Others are reluctant to challenge stated values, especially when the language of moral injury is used to preempt critique. The individual's stated identity is accepted as true, even when it conflicts with observable behavior. This creates a form of moral immunity. The subject continues to act in contradiction without structural consequence. Their identity remains positive because it is defined by narrative consistency, not behavioral consistency. The result is reputational inflation. The gap between who the subject is and who they claim to be expands. The dissonance is sustained by repetition. Eventually, the subject believes the narrative more than they believe the record. This is not hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It is narrative inertia. The moral identity no longer depends on action. It depends on the refusal to examine action. The individual is not who they have been. They are who they insist they meant to be. Most self-expression is not communication. It is preemptive justification for the version of the self that is already being protected. The concept of self-expression is framed as a form of authenticity. The individual articulates thoughts, feelings, and preferences as a means of being known. This expression is assumed to reflect internal reality. However, in most cases, self-expression is not constructed to reveal. It is constructed to predefend. What is being expressed is not the full internal landscape. It is a curated sample designed to justify a pre-existing behavioral posture. The function is less about sharing and more about protecting. The expression prepares the environment for the individual's preferred limits. Statements such as, "I'm just not good with conflict," or "that's just how I process things," are not invitations to understanding. They are declarations of constraint. The speaker does not expect feedback. They expect compliance. Expression becomes an explanatory boundary. The internal experience may be more complex, contradictory, or unresolved than the expression suggests. But complexity invites negotiation. Simplicity invites control. Therefore, expression is reduced to statements that reinforce the behavioral logic already in operation. This pattern produces expressive inertia. The individual repeats the same descriptions of themselves until those descriptions become fixed. The narrative stops evolving. The content of the expression is no longer tested against behavior. It becomes self-reinforcing language that permits continued avoidance of dissonance. This process is further stabilized by social feedback. Others accept the description at face value. The expression becomes identity. The individual is no longer required to interrogate whether their stated characteristics are still accurate or adaptive. Self-expression ceases to be a function of introspection. It becomes a defense mechanism optimized for predictability and low-friction interaction. The subject appears transparent, but what has been revealed is not truth. It is strategy. The pursuit of growth is frequently a mechanism to avoid the emotional cost of admitting stagnation. Growth is commonly presented as a linear process, an upward trajectory of learning, change, and self-improvement. This framing implies that forward motion is evidence of adaptation. But in many cases, the pursuit of growth is not motivated by insight. It is a structural defense against acknowledging that nothing has actually changed. The belief in progress protects the subject from confronting stagnation. By adopting a growth narrative, the system avoids the emotional and reputational cost of admitting inertia. The language of development is deployed as proof of motion, even when behavior remains static. This narrative is maintained through substitution. The subject replaces depth with variety. They try new practices, read new material, adopt new routines. These substitutions generate novelty, which is then mistaken for transformation. But the foundational logic, the assumptions, defenses, and relational dynamics remains unchanged. External metrics reinforce the illusion. The subject receives validation for appearing intentional. Language such as doing the work or leaning into discomfort is rewarded, regardless of whether discomfort is actually encountered or resolved. The performance is enough. This creates a loop. The subject seeks validation for effort, not for outcome, because effort is easier to generate than integration. The system becomes effort maximizing and outcome indifferent. Progress is measured by proximity to growth language, not by internal modification. Over time, the pursuit becomes aesthetic. Growth is no longer pursued for resolution. It is pursued to maintain the identity of someone who is evolving. This identity shields the subject from scrutiny. As long as they are working on it, they are exempt from accountability. In this structure, growth becomes indistinguishable from avoidance. The subject appears mobile but is directionless. They appear aware but are unchanging. The performance of movement conceals the absence of arrival. Vulnerability is frequently used as a tool to disarm critique, not to increase relational transparency. Vulnerability is described as openness, revealing the self in ways that invite understanding, connection, and shared humanity. However, in many applications, vulnerability is not used to deepen mutual understanding. It is used to preempt critique by signaling fragility. The subject offers selective exposure. They disclose pain, confusion, or fear, but only within contexts where such disclosures generate empathy. This converts vulnerability into a mechanism of control. The listener is placed in a moral bind. To challenge the speaker is now to harm someone who has just revealed weakness. This reconfigures the power dynamic. The speaker retains narrative authority. They define the terms of engagement. Vulnerability becomes a defensive tactic masquerading as relational honesty. The disclosure is real, but its timing and framing are calculated. This strategy is effective because it interrupts confrontation. The subject is not forced to account for contradictions, harm, or distortion. They present their emotional state as evidence that they are already suffering. This shifts the focus away from responsibility and toward care. Over time, this pattern creates a form of expressive immunity. The subject maintains control by continually reframing conflict as wounding. They are not corrected. They are consoled. The system no longer engages with behavior. It engages with emotion. This does not build intimacy. It builds caution. The listener becomes aware that pushback will trigger vulnerability. and begins to censor their response. This reduces friction, but also reduces authenticity. The relationship stabilizes through mutual performance. The cost is precision. Conversations lose clarity. Accountability is suspended. Vulnerability has not created connection. It has created insulation, using disclosure to prevent examination. The subject appears honest. But what has been shared is not a window. It is a barrier. Gratitude is often used to suppress discontent when structural change is no longer considered possible. Gratitude is framed as a corrective lens, a way to reduce suffering by shifting focus from lack to abundance. In psychological and cultural discourse, gratitude is treated as evidence of perspective, maturity, and emotional health. However, in many cases, gratitude is deployed not to access contentment, but to suppress discontent that the system no longer believes it can afford to examine. When dissatisfaction becomes structurally or socially impermissible, due to obligations, resource constraints, or moral framing, gratitude is introduced as an override. It functions as a narrative inhibitor. The subject acknowledges their discomfort, but neutralizes it by referencing perceived privilege or comparative suffering. This does not resolve the underlying discomfort. It isolates it. The gratitude script is repeated until it becomes automatic. At least I have a job. Other people have it worse. I should just be thankful. These phrases do not emerge from clarity. They emerge from resignation. Discontent that cannot be acted upon must be reframed. Gratitude becomes the acceptable narrative. It replaces analysis with submission. The system remains unchanged, but the subject becomes quieter. The gratitude performance is interpreted as peace, when it is more accurately a withdrawal from the possibility of improvement. Over time, this strategy becomes identity. The subject is seen as content, grounded, or humble, but beneath the surface, the original dissatisfaction persists, unchallenged, unnamed, and now unsupported. Gratitude has not integrated the discontent. It has invalidated it. In this form, gratitude functions as compliance. The system rewards the subject for being manageable. The internal cost is the abandonment of clarity. The subject cannot assess their condition accurately, because their discomfort is now morally disallowed. Gratitude ceases to be a virtue. It becomes an inhibitor of necessary confrontation. Most forms of acceptance are structured around powerlessness, not understanding. Acceptance is frequently presented as the final stage of psychological resolution. It is associated with peace, maturity, and clarity. But acceptance often emerges not from comprehension or integration, but from fatigue and limitation. The system stops fighting not because it has reached understanding, but because it has exhausted its options. This exhaustion is reframed as wisdom. The subject describes themselves as letting go, trusting the process, or surrendering. But these phrases mask a structural reality. Agency has failed. The individual has been unable to alter the condition, obtain justice, or escape contradiction. In the absence of power, the system shifts to passivity. This passivity is not inherently negative. It can reduce psychological stress, but it is often mistaken for clarity. The subject believes they have evolved. In fact, they have ceased to resist. They no longer expect change, so they restructure their expectations around tolerability. What is called peace may be indistinguishable from detachment. The underlying condition remains, but emotional response has been suppressed. This suppression is interpreted as resolution. The subject has not adapted to the condition. They have adapted to their inability to change it. Social reinforcement maintains the illusion. Acceptance is rewarded. Resistance is pathologized. The subject internalizes the idea that protest or dissatisfaction indicates failure to grow. This framing pressures the system to adopt acceptance prematurely. Once acceptance is declared, re-engagement becomes costly. To challenge the condition again would be to admit that the acceptance was not genuine. This increases emotional risk. The subject continues to perform stability to protect the narrative of peace. Acceptance, in this form, is not the result of wisdom. It is the result of strategic disengagement from problems deemed unsolvable. Closeness is often maintained by avoiding the truths that would threaten it. Intimacy is commonly equated with openness, the willingness to be seen fully and to see others without distortion. But in most sustained relationships, closeness is not protected by mutual truth. It is protected by mutual restraint. Certain subjects are avoided. Certain contradictions are ignored. Truth becomes a threat, not a foundation. The stability of the relationship is contingent on these omissions. The participants learn what can and cannot be said. They navigate each other through practiced silence. This is called understanding, but it is a performance of compatibility that depends on managed disclosure. When truth threatens the established dynamic, it is suppressed. A hidden resentment, an unspoken desire, or an unacknowledged power imbalance is not confronted. It is contained. The subject tells themselves they are preserving the connection. In reality, they are preserving the structure that allows the connection to exist without rupture. This structure cannot tolerate truth that redefines roles, challenges memory, or reinterprets motive. Honesty in this context would destabilize the behavioral loop. It would require reassessment. The participants avoid this because the reassessment might lead to separation, confrontation, or identity fragmentation. The longer the structure persists, the more difficult confrontation becomes. The omission solidifies. It becomes part of the relational architecture. To introduce it would be to declare that the relationship has been partially constructed on avoidance. This is why most long-standing relationships are not sustained by transparency. They are sustained by selective opacity. Closeness is preserved not through knowing, but through the mutual agreement to not fully see. The connection remains intact, but it is protected by the one thing intimacy claims to oppose: silence. Self-reflection frequently serves as a substitute for structural change rather than a mechanism for it. Self-reflection is presented as a foundational component of growth. The subject looks inward, identifies patterns, and articulates causes. This process is interpreted as transformative, but in most cases, reflection is not followed by structural change. It functions instead as a compensatory act, an internal signal that allows the subject to feel mobilized despite taking no external action. This disjunction is not subtle. The individual may repeatedly recognize the same behavior, narrate the same insight, and express the same regret. These admissions appear sincere. However, they are often self-contained. The system recycles awareness without reconfiguring the conditions that produce the pattern. Over time, this leads to narrative entrenchment. The subject becomes more fluent in describing their dysfunction. They acquire vocabulary, psychological framing, and explanatory consistency. The reflection increases in sophistication, but the behavior persists. This is not a failure of honesty. It is a failure of consequence. The reflection becomes its own reward. The act of recognition is interpreted as progress. The absence of integration is ignored. Self-understanding becomes performance. In this structure, reflection is not diagnostic. It is therapeutic. The subject uses it to maintain internal stability. They believe they are doing the work, but no measurable deviation occurs. The conditions that sustain the pattern remain untouched. Eventually, the reflection becomes identity. The subject believes their depth of self-awareness distinguishes them, even as their behavior repeats. Others reinforce this belief. They interpret reflection as sensitivity or growth. The absence of change is overlooked. What is framed as maturity may be indistinguishable from a system that has learned to narrate itself without correcting itself. The subject is not unaware. They are unresponsive. Saying less is often interpreted as wisdom when it is actually a strategy for risk reduction. Silence, brevity, and minimal expression are frequently read as indicators of composure, discernment, or depth. The individual who speaks less is assumed to think more. But in many cases, this economy of speech is not an indication of clarity. It is a tactic for limiting exposure. The less the subject says, the less they can be evaluated, contradicted, or misunderstood. Speech becomes a liability. The system adapts by minimizing output. The appearance of calm is maintained, but this calm is not internal peace. It is risk management. This behavioral economy often develops in high-cost environments. When expression has led to conflict, exclusion, or distortion, the subject reduces input. They become strategic. Information is rationed. Emotional content is filtered. Uncertainty is avoided through omission. The result is a pattern of guarded presence. The individual is physically and socially present, but narratively absent. Others interpret this as restraint. It is interpreted as strength. But the silence is not based on confidence. It is based on containment. Over time, this strategy becomes aesthetic. The subject is perceived as thoughtful, controlled, or mysterious. These interpretations shield them from inquiry. Their inner world remains opaque, not because it is empty, but because it is inaccessible. This inaccessibility protects the subject from contradiction. Their beliefs are not examined. Their motives are not tested. Their inconsistencies are not exposed. Speech would introduce vulnerability. Silence preserves ambiguity. The system is not open. It is defended. The subject does not speak less because they have nothing to prove. They speak less because they believe proving anything is a threat. Changing one's mind is rarely evidence of flexibility. It is often the collapse of a belief that was maintained without internal coherence. Changing a belief is framed as intellectual humility. The subject is seen as open, adaptive, and evolving. But belief change is often not the result of thoughtful reconsideration. It occurs because the original belief could not withstand continued contradiction. The system collapses not by choice, but by pressure. Most beliefs are not built from evidence. They are inherited, absorbed, or emotionally adopted. They serve a structural purpose, offering identity, social placement, or internal consistency. The subject defends them not because they are true, but because they are functional. As contradiction accumulates, tension increases. The subject experiences dissonance but resists revision. They double down. They reinterpret evidence. They adjust language without adjusting structure. This delay is misinterpreted as conviction. Eventually, the belief reaches a failure point. It can no longer produce coherence. The contradictions become uncontainable. The subject abandons the belief, not because they have developed a better framework, but because the old one can no longer be used. This process is then rebranded as growth. The subject claims they changed their mind after careful thought, but the change was not proactive. It was reactive. The system did not evolve. It broke. This distinction matters. True revision occurs when new data is integrated into a stable system. Belief collapse is different. It leaves the system destabilized. The subject may adopt a new belief, but the new belief is often adopted rapidly, without examination, because the subject requires structure. The cycle repeats. Beliefs are held until they fail, then replaced, renamed, and defended again. What appears as flexibility is often structural fragility that has learned how to narrate itself favorably.